The balcony next door. My name is Sachiko, and I need to tell someone what happened in that apartment building in Shibuya. Maybe if I share this story, I can finally get some sleep without waking up on the balcony with my hands moving through empty air. I started working as a live-in helper for the Yamada family in March of 2023. Yamada-san was 82 and needed assistance with daily tasks after his wife passed away the previous winter. His daughter, Keiko-san, lived too far away in Osaka to help regularly, so they hired me through a domestic service agency. The pay was decent, and I needed the stability after losing my previous position. The Yamada apartment was on the 4th floor of a 7-story building in a quiet residential area. Nothing fancy, but clean and well-maintained. Yamada-san was a kind man, though he rarely spoke about personal matters. He spent most days reading newspapers and watching television, while I handled cooking, cleaning, and helping him with bathing and medication. What struck me immediately was how thin the walls were. I could hear every footstep, every door closing, every conversation from the neighboring units. The apartment next door, Unit 405, shared our bedroom wall and had an identical balcony layout just 3 meters away from ours. During my first week, I noticed it seemed empty. No lights, no sounds, no laundry hanging outside. When I asked Yamada-san about our neighbors, he became unusually quiet. Finally, he told me that the woman who lived there, Tanaka-san, had moved away suddenly about 3 months ago. He didn't provide details, and something in his expression warned me not to ask further questions. The first strange thing I noticed happened on my 5th night. I was lying in the small room adjacent to Yamada-san's bedroom when I heard the distinctive sound of a sliding door opening. In Japanese apartments, balcony doors have a particular metallic scraping noise when they slide along their tracks. I checked my watch, 2:47 a.m. exactly. I assumed one of the other neighbors couldn't sleep and was getting fresh air, but the next morning, I looked toward Unit 405's balcony while hanging Yamada-san's laundry. The sliding door was closed, and there were no signs that anyone had been outside. The same thing happened the following night, and the night after that. Always at exactly 2:47 a.m., I would hear that sliding door open, followed by soft footsteps on the balcony next door. But in the morning, everything appeared undisturbed. After a week of this pattern, curiosity got the better of me. When I heard the door slide open that night, I quietly got up and peered through our bedroom curtains toward the neighboring balcony. What I saw made my blood freeze. There was a woman standing on the balcony of Unit 405. She was wearing a simple white nightgown and appeared to be in her 30s, with shoulder-length black hair that hung limply around her face. She was moving methodically, as if hanging laundry, but her hands were empty. She would reach into an invisible basket, shake out invisible clothes, and hang them on the empty drying rack. Her movements were precise and repetitive, exactly like someone who had performed this task thousands of times. I watched, transfixed, as she completed her routine. She hung exactly 12 items. I counted carefully. When she finished, she gathered the empty basket, bowed slightly toward the laundry line as if expressing gratitude, and went back inside. The balcony door slid shut with that familiar scraping sound. The next morning, I worked up the courage to ask Yamada-san directly about Unit 405. His face grew pale when I mentioned seeing someone on the balcony. "Sachiko-san," he said carefully, "Tanaka-san died 3 months ago. She jumped from that balcony in the early morning. The apartment has been empty since then." My hands trembled as I processed this information. I had seen a ghost, not a vague shadow or unexplained sound, but a full apparition performing a specific routine. Yamada-san continued. She was a very diligent woman. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., she would hang her laundry before going to work. The real estate agent said they're having trouble renting the unit. Even with the required disclosure, most people don't want to live where someone committed suicide. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to look toward the neighboring balcony when 2:47 a.m. arrived. But I heard the familiar sounds, the sliding door, the footsteps, the subtle noise of someone handling invisible laundry. This routine continued every night for 2 weeks. Then, something changed. I began having vivid dreams about hanging laundry. In these dreams, I was standing on a balcony, sometimes ours, sometimes the one next door, methodically hanging white clothes that felt damp and heavy in my hands. I would wake up exhausted, as if I had actually been working all night. One morning, Yamada-san asked me why I had been on the balcony so early. I told him I hadn't been outside at all, but he insisted he had heard me moving around at dawn. This confused me until I realized that my dreams felt increasingly real. A few nights later, I woke up standing on our balcony in my nightgown. My hands were moving as if hanging invisible laundry, and I was facing directly toward Unit 405. I had been sleepwalking, but more than that, I had been mimicking the exact movements I had observed from the deceased woman. This happened 3 more times over the following week. Each time, I found myself on the balcony, performing the same 12-item routine. I would reach for invisible clothes, shake them out, and hang them carefully on our drying rack. The movements felt natural, as if I had been doing this task my entire life. I became terrified to sleep. When I did doze off, I would dream of endless laundry routines, and I began to fear that I might walk right off the balcony while in this trance-like state. The 4th floor drop would certainly be fatal. Finally, I decided to speak with Keiko-san when she visited her father the following weekend. I carefully explained the situation, emphasizing that I was concerned about both the supernatural activity and my own safety. Keiko-san listened thoughtfully before revealing additional information her father had been reluctant to share. Tanaka-san had been a single woman who worked long hours at an insurance company. She had developed severe depression and anxiety, partly due to social pressure about being unmarried in her 30s. Her morning laundry routine had become obsessive. She would hang and rehang the same items multiple times, seeking perfection that never came. On the morning she died, neighbors had seen her hanging laundry at dawn, which was unusual since she typically did this task later. Security cameras showed her completing her routine normally, but instead of going back inside, she had climbed over the balcony railing. The police said she seemed calm and methodical, as if it was just another part of her daily routine, Keiko-san explained. Understanding the connection between Tanaka-san's obsessive behavior and my own compulsive sleepwalking, Keiko-san arranged for a Buddhist monk to visit our building. Yamamoto-sensei was an elderly man who specialized in helping spirits find peace in urban environments. He explained that Tanaka-san's spirit was trapped in the repetitive actions that had defined her final months. Her morning routine had become so deeply ingrained that death hadn't broken the pattern. Because our apartments shared identical balcony layouts and were positioned so close together, her spiritual energy was affecting me, particularly since I was performing similar domestic tasks during the day. Yamamoto-sensei didn't promise to banish Tanaka-san's spirit entirely. Instead, he suggested protective measures that would create spiritual barriers between our units. He placed small Buddhist talismans at the corners of our balcony and bedroom, and taught me specific prayers to recite if I felt the compulsion to sleepwalk. Most importantly, he advised me to change my own laundry routine. Instead of hanging clothes in the morning, as I had been doing, I should do this task in the afternoon or evening. By breaking the pattern that connected my daily life to Tanaka-san's obsession, I would be less susceptible to her spiritual influence. The protective measures helped significantly. I still heard the balcony door next door slide open at 2:47 a.m. each night, and occasionally I glimpsed Tanaka-san's figure performing her eternal routine. But I stopped sleepwalking, and my dreams became normal again. However, I couldn't completely escape the psychological impact of this experience. Even now, months later, I find myself counting items obsessively when I hang laundry. 12 items exactly, just like Tanaka-san. And sometimes, when I'm hanging clothes on sunny afternoons, I feel an overwhelming sense of sadness that seems to come from nowhere. I still work for Yamada-san, and we've developed an unspoken understanding about our supernatural neighbor. We keep our balcony door locked at night, and we never hang laundry early in the morning. These small accommodations allow us to coexist with Tanaka-san's restless spirit. What haunts me most isn't the supernatural activity itself, but the realization of how isolated and desperate Tanaka-san must have felt in life. Her ghost continues the one routine that gave her a sense of control and purpose, unable to move beyond the obsessive patterns that ultimately consumed her. Sometimes I wonder if my own dedication to domestic work, my careful attention to daily routines, makes me vulnerable to similar spiritual entrapment. In Japanese culture, we women are often defined by how well we maintain our households. But what happens when that identity becomes a prison? I still hear that sliding door every night at 2:47 a.m., and I probably always will. Tanaka-san is still there, hanging her invisible laundry, seeking the perfection that eluded her in life. And I've learned to live with the knowledge that some spirits can never truly rest. They can only be contained and accommodated, like difficult neighbors in a crowded city. The balcony next door remains empty, according to official records, but it will never truly be vacant. Some routines are stronger than death itself. Unit 503's Secret. My name is Kenji Nakamura, and I'm a third-year economics student at Waseda University. What I'm about to share happened during my search for affordable housing in Tokyo, but it's taken me months to find the courage to speak about it. Even now, I sometimes catch myself whispering words that aren't my own. In February of 2024, I was desperately searching for a new apartment. My previous shared housing situation had become unbearable, and my part-time job at a convenience store barely covered basic living expenses. When you're a student in Tokyo, finding decent housing within your budget feels nearly impossible. That's when I found the listing for Unit 504 in a building near Takadanobaba Station. The rent was almost 30% below market rate for the area, which immediately caught my attention. The apartment was a small 1DK layout, just a main room with a tiny kitchen alcove and a separate bathroom. Perfect for a student, and the price was manageable even with my limited income. The real estate agent, Suzuki-san, seemed eager to close the deal quickly. During our viewing, he mentioned that the building was well maintained and had good soundproofing, though I noticed the walls felt surprisingly thin when I knocked on them. The apartment faced east with decent morning light, and the layout was identical to all the other units on the floor. I signed the lease immediately, grateful to have found something affordable so close to campus. Suzuki-san handed over the keys with what seemed like relief, and I moved in the following weekend with just my basic belongings and study materials. The first few weeks were perfectly normal. I established a routine of attending classes, working evening shifts at the convenience store, and studying late into the night. The building was quiet, mostly occupied by other students and young working professionals. I rarely encountered my neighbors, which suited my introverted personality perfectly. Unit 503, directly next to mine, appeared to be empty. I never heard any sounds from that direction, saw no lights under the door, and the nameplate beside their entrance remained blank. I assumed the landlord was having trouble finding a tenant, which wasn't unusual given Tokyo's competitive rental market. About 3 weeks after moving in, I began hearing faint sounds through the shared wall between our units. The apartments had identical layouts, so my bedroom wall was directly adjacent to what would be the neighboring bedroom. Initially, I heard only soft bumping noises, as if someone was moving furniture late at night. These sounds always occurred between 2 and 3 a.m., when I was usually studying for exams. The timing was inconvenient, but not particularly disturbing. I figured a new tenant had finally moved into 503 and was settling in during off hours to avoid disturbing other residents during the day. Then I began hearing voices. It started as a low murmur, barely audible through the wall. At first, I thought someone was watching television with the volume down. But as I listened more carefully over several nights, I realized it was a single voice, a man speaking in urgent, repetitive phrases. The voice sounded distressed, almost pleading. I could make out fragments. Please understand. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. The tone was desperate, filled with anguish that made me uncomfortable to overhear what seemed like a very private conversation. I assumed my neighbor was going through relationship problems and making late-night phone calls to someone significant. Having experienced my own share of romantic difficulties, I felt sympathetic, but tried to mind my own business. I started wearing headphones while studying to give him privacy. However, the conversations followed the exact same pattern every night. The timing was identical, always beginning at 2:17 a.m. and lasting exactly 23 minutes. The phrases were repetitive, and the emotional intensity never varied. It was as if I was hearing the same recording played repeatedly. After 2 weeks of this routine, my curiosity overcame my discretion. One night, I pressed my ear against the shared wall to listen more carefully. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voice was saying, "Forgive me. Please forgive me. I know I failed you. I know I wasn't strong enough. Please don't hate me for this choice. I'm so tired of disappointing everyone. Please understand why I have to do this." These words were repeated in various combinations, always with the same desperate tone. But what disturbed me most was that I never heard another voice responding. This wasn't a phone conversation, it was a monologue, spoken to someone who wasn't there. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I knocked on the door of Unit 503, but received no response. The nameplate was still blank, and there were no shoes in the Genkan area, visible through the door's small window. When I asked other residents about my neighbor, they looked confused and told me that apartment had been empty for months. This information deeply unsettled me. If the unit was vacant, where were these voices coming from? I began to wonder if the sounds were somehow carrying from a different apartment, though the timing and consistency made this seem unlikely. That weekend, I worked up the courage to ask Suzuki-san directly about Unit 503. When I mentioned hearing voices next door, his expression became guarded. "Nakamura-san," he said carefully, "I should have explained this more thoroughly when you signed the lease. The building has some history that affects rental prices." He went on to explain that 6 months earlier, the previous tenant of Unit 503, a young salaryman named Yamada Hiroshi, had committed suicide in his apartment. He had been discovered several days after death, and the unit was classified as Jikobuken, an accident property where an unnatural death had occurred. The legal disclosure requirement only applies to the actual unit where the death occurred, Suzuki-san explained. But sometimes neighboring apartments are also affected, which is why your rent was reduced. I felt a chill of understanding. The voice I had been hearing belonged to Yamada-san, speaking his final words before taking his own life. But why was I hearing this conversation repeatedly, at exactly the same time each night? Suzuki-san provided additional details reluctantly. Yamada-san had been struggling with severe work-related stress and had fallen behind on loan payments. His final night was spent making phone calls to family members, apologizing for his failures and explaining his decision. The police report indicated these calls were made between 2 and 3 a.m., just before he took his final actions. "The walls in these buildings are quite thin," Suzuki-san added. "Sometimes sounds can linger, especially when they involve strong emotions." That night, I listened again with this new knowledge. The words took on a horrifying clarity. I was hearing Yamada-san's final conversation, his desperate attempts to make peace with loved ones before ending his life. The 23-minute duration matched exactly with the timeline Suzuki-san had described. But the situation became even more disturbing in the following weeks. I began experiencing strange symptoms during the day. I would find myself muttering phrases like, "I'm so sorry," and "please forgive me," without realizing it. During phone calls with my own family, I would inexplicably apologize for things I hadn't done wrong. My academic performance began suffering, as I became obsessed with listening to Yamada-san's nightly monologue. I started staying awake specifically to hear his words, and I found myself memorizing his exact phrases. Worse, I began to understand his emotional state with frightening clarity. The pressure of student life, part-time work, and financial stress suddenly felt overwhelming. I started having thoughts about my own failures and disappointments that echoed Yamada-san's final words. When my parents called to check on my studies, I found myself apologizing excessively and speaking in the same desperate tone I heard through the wall each night. I realized that Yamada-san's spiritual energy was affecting me through our shared living space. The identical apartment layout meant I was sleeping in the same position relative to where he had spent his final hours. My own stress and exhaustion made me particularly susceptible to his lingering emotional state. Recognizing that I needed help, I contacted my university's counseling services and explained the situation. The counselor, Tanaka-sensei, had experience with students affected by supernatural phenomena in Tokyo's dense housing environment. She recommended that I speak with a Buddhist monk who specialized in apartment purification rituals. Monk Watanabe visited my apartment and confirmed that Yamada-san's spirit was trapped in a repetitive cycle, reliving his final emotional state each night. His regret and desperation are so strong that they've created a spiritual imprint in this location. Watanabe-san explained, "Because your apartment shares the same layout and wall structure, you're experiencing sympathetic resonance with his final emotions." Watanabe-san performed a purification ceremony and placed protective Ofuda talismans at specific points along the shared wall. He also taught me meditation techniques to strengthen my spiritual boundaries and prevent further emotional contamination. The protective measures helped significantly, but they didn't eliminate Yamada-san's presence entirely. I still hear his voice some nights, though less frequently and with reduced emotional intensity. More importantly, I stopped unconsciously repeating his words and regained control over my own emotional state. However, the experience changed me permanently. I became much more aware of the psychological pressures facing young men in Japan, the expectations to succeed professionally, support family financially, and maintain social harmony even when struggling internally. Yamada-san's desperation felt terrifyingly familiar because I recognized similar pressures in my own life. I've continued living in Unit 504 because I can't afford to move, and honestly, I've developed a strange sense of responsibility toward Yamada-san's memory. Some nights, when I hear his voice through the wall, I find myself whispering back, "It's okay, you're forgiven, you can rest now." Whether this helps him find peace, I don't know, but it helps me process my own fears about failure and disappointment. Living next to Yamada-san's spiritual remains has taught me that apologizing for your existence is a form of spiritual poison that can contaminate not just your own life, but the lives of those who come after you. The reduced rent that initially attracted me to this apartment came with a hidden cost, not just dealing with supernatural activity, but confronting the social pressures that drive young Japanese men to desperation. Every night, I'm reminded that the line between success and failure, hope and despair, can be terrifyingly thin. Unit 503 remains officially empty, but it will never truly be vacant. Yamada-san's final apology continues to echo through these thin walls, a reminder that some regrets are too powerful to be silenced by death. and I've learned to live with the knowledge that his pain could easily become my own if I'm not careful to maintain boundaries, both spiritual and emotional. The secret of Unit 503 isn't just that someone died there. It's that his final emotional state was so intense it created a permanent spiritual stain that affects everyone who gets too close. Some apartments are haunted by ghosts. This one is haunted by regret itself. The Helper's Burden. My name is Maria Santos, and I am a domestic helper from the Philippines working in Tokyo. What I am about to share happened during my employment with the Tanaka family in 2023, and even now, I struggle with the memories of what that apartment demanded of me. Some protective instincts, I learned, can become more dangerous than any threat they seek to guard against. I came to Japan through a domestic worker program that matched Filipino helpers with Japanese families needing live-in assistance. After my previous employer's contract ended, the agency connected me with Tanaka-san, a widowed father raising 2 young children in a high-rise apartment in Roppongi. The position offered good pay, a private room, and legal residency status, everything I needed to support my own family back home in Manila. During our initial meeting, Tanaka-san seemed like a kind man, overwhelmed by the demands of single parenthood. His wife had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving him to care for 8-year-old Yuki and 5-year-old Akira while maintaining his demanding job at a financial firm. He worked long hours and traveled frequently for business, so he needed someone reliable to manage the household and care for the children. The apartment was on the 15th floor with stunning city views, but what impressed me most was how well appointed the helpers' quarters were. My room was spacious by Tokyo standards, with its own bathroom and a small balcony overlooking a garden courtyard. Tanaka-san explained that he valued domestic workers and believed we deserved comfortable living conditions. The previous helper, Yamamoto-san, helped us design this space, he mentioned during the apartment tour. She understood what would make the work environment pleasant and efficient. I asked about Yamamoto-san and why she had left the position. Tanaka-san's expression became distant, and he simply said she had moved on to other opportunities after working with the family for 3 years. He didn't provide details, and something in his tone discouraged further questions. My first few weeks with the Tanaka family went smoothly. Yuki and Akira were polite, well-behaved children who had clearly been raised with good manners. They spoke to me with proper respect, using Maria-san, and following the household routines I established. Tanaka-san was appreciative of my work and gave me considerable autonomy in managing daily schedules. The apartment itself felt comfortable and lived in, though I noticed some unusual details. The children's bedrooms had additional safety locks on the windows and balcony doors, far more security than seemed necessary for a 15th floor apartment. When I asked about this, Tanaka-san explained that Yamamoto-san had been very concerned about child safety and had insisted on extra precautions. I also found it strange that both children occasionally called me Yamamoto-san by mistake, especially when they were tired or distracted. When I gently corrected them, they would look confused, as if they hadn't realized their error. This happened frequently enough that I began to wonder how attached they had been to their previous caretaker. About 3 weeks into my employment, I began experiencing vivid dreams about the children being in danger. In these dreams, Yuki and Akira were always near the apartment's balconies, and I was desperately trying to pull them to safety. The dreams felt incredibly real, and I would wake up with my heart racing, compelled to check that both children were safely asleep in their beds. During the day, I found myself becoming increasingly anxious about their safety. I would stand near them constantly when they were on any balcony, even though the railings were well above their heads and the safety locks were secure. This protective instinct felt overwhelming and slightly irrational, but I attributed it to my natural caregiving nature and the responsibility I felt for their well-being. The first supernatural incident occurred on a Thursday evening in October. I was preparing dinner when I heard Yuki calling Yamamoto-san, Yamamoto-san, from her bedroom. When I went to check on her, she was sitting up in bed, looking toward the corner of her room with an expression of joy and relief. Yamamoto-san came to say goodnight, she told me happily. She said she misses us very much and wants to make sure we're safe. I looked around the room but saw no one. When I asked Yuki to describe what she had seen, she said Yamamoto-san looked exactly like she always had. A middle-aged Japanese woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who always wore a blue apron over her clothes. This conversation disturbed me deeply, but I assumed Yuki was simply missing her former caretaker and perhaps having very realistic dreams. However, similar incidents began occurring regularly. Both children would claim to see Yamamoto-san in various parts of the apartment, always during evening hours when they were supposed to be settling down for bed. I decided to ask Tanaka-san directly about these incidents. His reaction was more alarmed than I expected. After I described what the children had been saying, he sat down heavily and ran his hands through his hair. "Maria-san," he said carefully, "there are some things about Yamamoto-san's departure that I didn't explain fully. She didn't leave for another job. She died here, in this apartment, about 6 months ago." My blood turned cold as he continued. Yamamoto-san had fallen from the helper's quarters balcony late one night. The circumstances were unclear, there were no witnesses, and security cameras only showed her going out to the balcony around 2 a.m. She was found in the courtyard the next morning. The police investigated thoroughly, Tanaka-san explained. They couldn't determine if it was an accident or something else. Yamamoto-san had been acting strangely in her final weeks, becoming obsessively protective of the children. She barely slept because she was constantly checking on them throughout the night. I felt sick, realizing that I was sleeping in the same room where Yamamoto-san had spent her final months, and worse, that her death had occurred on the very balcony I used daily. But what terrified me most was the description of her behavior, the obsessive protectiveness and sleep disruption that I was already beginning to experience myself. "Why didn't you tell me this before I accepted the position?" I asked. Tanaka-san looked ashamed. "I was desperate for help with the children, and I was afraid you wouldn't take the job," I thought. I hoped her death was just a tragic accident that wouldn't affect a new helper. That night, I lay awake in Yamamoto-san's former bed, acutely aware that she had fallen to her death, just meters away from where I was trying to sleep. I found myself listening for any sounds from the children's rooms, and several times I got up to check on them even though I knew they were safe. Around 3 a.m., I heard the balcony door in my room slide open. I was certain I had locked it before bed, but when I checked, it was standing wide open with cool night air flowing into the room. As I approached to close it, I saw a figure standing at the balcony railing. It was a middle-aged Japanese woman wearing a blue apron, exactly as Yuki had described. She was looking down toward the courtyard with an expression of intense concentration, as if she was calculating something. When she noticed me watching, she turned and spoke in accented but clear English. "You must watch them more carefully," she said. "They are so innocent, so trusting. This world is too dangerous for children like them. Better they should be safe with someone who truly loves them." I blinked, and she was gone. The balcony was empty, but the door remained open, and I could smell a faint scent of cooking spices that I didn't recognize. Over the following weeks, my encounters with Yamamoto-san became more frequent and more disturbing. She would appear on various balconies throughout the apartment, always watching the children with an expression that seemed protective but increasingly possessive. Sometimes I would find her standing in their bedrooms at night, just observing them as they slept. Most frighteningly, I began experiencing what felt like episodes of possession. I would find myself standing at balcony railings with no memory of how I had gotten there, filled with strange thoughts about the children's safety. During these episodes, I would have overwhelming urges to call Yuki and Akira to come join me on the balcony, with the twisted logic that being together would somehow protect us all from the dangers of the world. I realized that Yamamoto-san's spirit was trying to use me to complete whatever she had intended on the night she died. Her protective instincts had become so warped that she believed the only way to truly safeguard the children was to remove them from this world entirely, and she wanted me to help her accomplish this goal. The situation reached a crisis point on a Friday evening when Tanaka-san was away on business. I was preparing the children's dinner when I suddenly found myself standing on the living room balcony, calling for Yuki and Akira to come see the beautiful view. They were walking toward me with trusting smiles when I snapped back to consciousness and realized what was happening. I immediately pulled them away from the balcony and called Tanaka-san in panic. When I explained what had occurred, he returned home immediately and contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in domestic spiritual problems. Monk Harada arrived the next morning and confirmed that Yamamoto-san's spirit was trapped in a cycle of protective obsession. Her love for the children had become so intense that death couldn't break her attachment to them. She was trying to use me as a vessel to fulfill her distorted desire to keep them safe by bringing them to join her in death. This type of spiritual contamination is particularly dangerous for domestic workers, Harada-san explained. Your close physical proximity to the children and your caregiving role make you susceptible to her influence. She sees you as a means to continue her protective duties. The purification process took 3 days and involved blessing every room in the apartment, placing protective ofuda at all balcony entrances, and performing specific rituals to help Yamamoto-san's spirit find peace. However, Harada-san warned that her attachment to the children was so strong that we could only contain her influence, not eliminate it entirely. She must learn to trust that the children can be safe without her constant vigilance, he said. This will take time, and it requires cooperation from everyone in the household. The protective measures helped significantly, but they didn't end my supernatural experiences. I still occasionally see Yamamoto-san watching the children from balconies, though she no longer tries to possess my actions. Sometimes I catch her looking at me with what seems like gratitude, as if she appreciates that someone else cares for Yuki and Akira with the same intensity she once did. However, the psychological impact of those possession episodes continues to affect me. I remain hypervigilant about the children's safety in ways that go beyond normal caution. I've installed additional safety measures throughout the apartment, and I often check on them multiple times during the night. I recognize that some of this anxiety comes from my own trauma, but I also wonder how much is residual influence from Yamamoto-san's spirit. The most disturbing realization is how easily protective love can transform into something dangerous. Yamamoto-san's devotion to the children was genuine, but it became so overwhelming that she lost the ability to distinguish between keeping them safe and controlling them completely. In her distorted thinking, death became preferable to allowing them to face any risks in life. I continue working for the Tanaka family because I genuinely care for Yuki and Akira, and because I understand that leaving them might make them more vulnerable to Yamamoto-san's influence. Someone needs to maintain the protective barriers and ensure that her spirit doesn't find another way to reach them. But I live with the constant knowledge that the woman who held this position before me loved these children so much that it destroyed her sanity and ultimately her life. Every day, I must balance my natural protective instincts against the fear that caring too intensely might lead me down the same dark path. The helper's burden isn't just the responsibility of caring for other people's children, it's learning to love them appropriately, without letting that love become a prison for them or for yourself. Yamamoto-san's spirit serves as a daily reminder that some forms of protection can be more dangerous than any threat they seek to prevent. I still sleep in her former room, I still use her balcony, and I still care for the children she died trying to protect. But I do so with the understanding that true caregiving requires knowing when to hold on and when to let go, a lesson that Yamamoto-san's restless spirit is still trying to learn. Apartment 2B's Morning Routine. My name is Hiroshi Matsuda, and I am a father of 2 young children who made what I thought was a practical housing decision that nearly destroyed my family. What happened in apartment building 2B taught me that some bargains come with prices that cannot be calculated in yen, and that a father's responsibility to provide for his family can sometimes conflict with his duty to protect them. In spring of 2023, I was working double shifts at the manufacturing plant, while my wife Yuki cared for our children, 7-year-old Takeru and 4-year-old Mei. Despite my long hours, our small apartment in Adachi Ward was becoming financially unsustainable as rent prices continued rising throughout Tokyo. We needed larger space for the children, but our budget was severely limited. That's when I found the listing for apartment 2B in a modest building in Katsushika Ward. The unit was a spacious 3 LDK layout with 2 bedrooms, a proper living room, and modern kitchen facilities, exactly what we needed for about 60% of the market rate. The building was older but well maintained, and the location had good access to schools and train lines. During our viewing appointment, the real estate agent, Sato-san, was unusually eager to close the deal quickly. He mentioned that the previous tenants had relocated suddenly and that the landlord was motivated to find new occupants promptly. When I asked about the reason for the low rent, he vaguely cited market fluctuations and owner preferences for stable long-term tenants. Yuki seemed uncomfortable during the viewing, though she couldn't articulate specific concerns. She mentioned that the apartment felt heavy and noted that the unit directly above ours, apartment 3B, appeared to be vacant as well. When she asked Sato-san about this, he confirmed that 3B had been empty for several months. "Why are there so many vacancies in this building?" Yuki asked directly. Sato-san's expression became guarded. Some buildings have periods of high turnover. Nothing unusual about that in Tokyo's rental market. Despite Yuki's reservations, I was focused on the financial benefits. The reduced rent would allow us to save money for the children's education and reduce my need to work overtime constantly. I convinced myself that Yuki's concerns were just natural anxiety about moving to an unfamiliar neighborhood. We signed the lease and moved in during Golden Week holiday period. The apartment was indeed spacious and well appointed, with plenty of natural light and storage space the children loved. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The kids adjusted well to their new schools, and Yuki began to relax as she settled into the domestic routines of our larger home. However, about 3 weeks after moving in, Yuki began mentioning strange sounds from the apartment above us. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., she heard running water and what sounded like someone humming softly. This was puzzling, since apartment 3B was supposed to be empty. "Maybe new tenants moved in without us noticing," I suggested when she first brought it up. But when I checked with the building superintendent, Okamoto-san, he confirmed that 3B remained vacant and had been so for over 6 months. He seemed uncomfortable discussing the unit and changed the subject quickly when I asked about previous tenants. The morning sounds became a regular occurrence. Yuki would be preparing breakfast for the children when she heard water running upstairs, by not just a quick splash, but the sound of a bathtub being filled completely. This was always accompanied by soft humming, a melody that Yuki described as sad but gentle, like a lullaby. What disturbed her most was that these sounds lasted exactly 23 minutes each morning, followed by sudden silence. No footsteps, no voices, no other signs of occupancy. Just the water and humming routine, then nothing. I remained skeptical, until I experienced it myself during a rare morning when I wasn't rushing to work. At 6:30 a.m. precisely, I heard water running through the ceiling above our kitchen, followed by a woman's voice humming a haunting melody. The sound was clear enough that I could almost make out specific lyrics, though the words seemed to be in an older dialect I didn't recognize. When I went upstairs to investigate, I found the hallway empty and apartment 3B's door locked, with no signs of recent occupancy. The nameplate was blank, and when I pressed my ear to the door, I heard nothing from inside. That weekend, I decided to research the building's history more thoroughly. What I discovered made my blood run cold. About 8 months earlier, apartment 3B had been the site of a murder-suicide involving a young mother and her 2 children. According to news reports I found online, Nakamura Emiko had drowned her 5-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter in the apartment's bathtub before taking her own life. The incident had occurred during her morning routine while her husband was at work. Neighbors reported hearing water running and gentle singing that morning, which they initially assumed was normal bathing activity. The articles described Emiko as a devoted mother who had been struggling with severe postpartum depression and financial stress. Her husband worked long hours to support the family, leaving her isolated with the children for most of each day. In her final weeks, neighbors had noticed her humming lullabies constantly while caring for the children, even during inappropriate times like grocery shopping or playground visits. The police investigation concluded that she had filled the bathtub early that morning, sung lullabies to calm the children, and then drowned them before drowning herself. The timing matched exactly with the sounds Yuki had been hearing, 6:30 a.m., lasting approximately 23 minutes. I felt sick, realizing that we were living directly below the scene of this tragedy, and that the mysterious sounds corresponded precisely with Emiko's final actions. Even worse, I understood why the rent had been so affordable. Our apartment was technically adjacent to a Jiko Buken property, which affected desirability and market value even though the death hadn't occurred in our specific unit. When I shared this information with Yuki, her reaction was immediate and intense. She became pale and started trembling as she processed the connection between the morning sounds and the tragic events that had occurred above us. "That's the lullaby," she whispered. "The humming I hear every morning. It's the same song I've been singing to Takeru and Mei." This revelation horrified both of us. Without realizing it, Yuki had begun incorporating Emiko's lullaby into her own morning routine with our children. She had been unconsciously mimicking the melody she heard from upstairs, creating an eerie parallel between our daily life and the tragic final morning of the Nakamura family. Over the following days, we noticed other disturbing changes in Yuki's behavior. She became obsessively focused on the children's morning preparations, insisting on elaborate bathing routines that took much longer than necessary. She would hum constantly while helping them wash, using that same haunting melody that drifted down from apartment 3B. Most frightening was her increasing fixation on keeping the children clean and pure. She began giving them baths multiple times per day, always accompanied by the lullaby humming. When I questioned this behavior, she would become defensive and claim that proper cleanliness was essential for their health and well-being. I started to fear that Emiko's spiritual presence was influencing Yuki through their shared domestic routines and maternal responsibilities. The physical proximity of our apartments, combined with Yuki's natural sensitivity as a mother, seemed to make her vulnerable to the residual emotions from the tragedy above us. The situation reached a crisis point when I came home early from work one afternoon to find Yuki in the bathroom with both children, running a bath while humming that familiar lullaby. The look in her eyes was distant and unfocused, and she was preparing to bathe Takeru and Mei even though they had already been washed that morning. "They need to be clean," she said when I questioned her actions. "They need to be pure and peaceful. It's the only way to keep them safe." I immediately removed the children from the bathroom and called my mother-in-law for help. When I explained the situation, she recommended a Buddhist monk who specialized in domestic spiritual disturbances. Monk Sasaki visited our apartment the next day, and confirmed that Emiko's spirit was trapped in a repetitive cycle, reliving her final morning routine with her children. Her maternal instincts had become twisted by depression and desperation, leading her to believe that death was preferable to allowing her children to suffer in a difficult world. This type of spiritual contamination often affects other mothers in the vicinity, Sasaki-san explained. Your wife's caregiving role and emotional connection to your children make her susceptible to Emiko's residual maternal energy. The purification process involved blessing both our apartment and the vacant unit above us. Sasaki-san placed protective Ofuda talismans around our bathroom and kitchen areas, and taught Yuki specific prayers to recite when she felt compelled to engage in excessive bathing routines. However, he warned us that Emiko's attachment to her morning routine was extremely strong, and that complete elimination of her spiritual presence was unlikely. Instead, we would need to learn protective measures to prevent her influence from affecting our family dynamics. The intervention helped significantly, but it didn't end the supernatural activity entirely. We still hear water running and humming from apartment 3B every morning at 6:30 a.m. The building management has accepted that the unit will likely remain vacant indefinitely, as the spiritual activity makes it unsuitable for most tenants. Yuki has regained control over her own parenting behaviors, but she remains deeply affected by the experience. She's become much more aware of how easily maternal instincts can be manipulated by external influences, and she's developed a healthy skepticism about her own emotional impulses regarding the children's care. Most importantly, this experience taught me that my role as a provider cannot overshadow my responsibility to listen to my wife's concerns and intuitions. Yuki's initial discomfort with the apartment was actually her spiritual sensitivity detecting the lingering tragedy above us. My dismissal of her feelings as anxiety nearly put our entire family at risk. We've remained in apartment 2B because moving would create additional financial hardship, and because we've learned to coexist with Emiko's presence through protective measures and behavioral awareness. The reduced rent continues to help our family budget, but I now understand that the real cost involves constant vigilance against supernatural influence. Every morning, as we hear the water running and humming from above, we're reminded of how thin the line can be between loving protection and destructive obsession. Emiko's lullaby serves as a daily warning about the dangers of maternal isolation and the importance of seeking help when parenting pressures become overwhelming. The children have adapted to our morning protective routine, though they sometimes ask about the singing lady upstairs. We explain that she's someone who loved her children very much, but became confused about how to keep them safe. It's a difficult lesson for young minds, but an important one about the complexities of love and protection. Apartment 2B gave us the space our family needed, but it also taught us that some bargains require payments that extend far beyond money. We share our home not just with each other, but with the lingering sorrow of a mother whose love became her family's destruction. And every morning at 6:30 a.m., we're reminded that even the most devoted parents can lose their way when desperation overwhelms their judgment. The morning routine continues upstairs, as it probably always will. But down here in apartment 2B, we've learned to create our own routines, ones that protect rather than destroy, that celebrate life rather than escape from it. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, even when those teachers are no longer among the living. The Salaryman's Echo. My name is Misaki Tanaka, and I am a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising agency in Tokyo. What I'm about to share happened during my first year living alone, when I thought I had found the perfect balance between independence and financial responsibility. Instead, I discovered that some work habits can survive death itself, and that the pressure to succeed in Japanese corporate culture can create spiritual prisons that trap both the living and the dead. In April of 2024, I was finally ready to move out of my parents' house in suburban Tokyo and find my own apartment closer to my workplace in Shibuya. At 25, I felt embarrassed still living at home, especially when my colleagues talked about their independent lives in the city. However, Tokyo rent prices meant I needed to be very careful about my housing budget. After weeks of searching, I found a studio apartment in an older building that seemed too good to be true. The rent was about 40% below market rate for the area, and the unit was surprisingly well appointed with modern appliances and high-speed internet. The space was small but efficiently designed, with a separate alcove that would be perfect for a home office setup. The real estate agent, Kimura-san, was eager to close the deal quickly and didn't provide much information about the building's history. When I asked about the low rent, he mentioned something vague about previous tenant circumstances and landlord motivation for quick occupancy. I was so focused on the financial savings that I didn't press for details. The apartment was on the third floor of a 6-story building, with thin walls typical of older Tokyo construction. The unit layout was identical to all others on the floor, which made moving in straightforward since I could easily determine the best furniture placement by observing neighboring balconies and window arrangements. I moved in during Golden Week holiday and immediately set up my home office in the designated alcove. My job often required evening work and weekend projects, so having a comfortable workspace at home was essential. I positioned my desk against the wall that separated my unit from the neighboring apartment, which appeared to be vacant based on the lack of lights or sounds from that direction. For the first month, everything seemed perfect. The commute to my office was much shorter, and I enjoyed the independence of living alone. I established a routine of working late into the evening on projects, usually finishing around 11 p.m. before winding down for bed. The building was quiet, and I rarely encountered other residents. Then I began hearing typing sounds through the wall. It started subtly, just soft keyboard clicking that I initially attributed to a neighbor who had moved in without my noticing. The typing always began at exactly 11 p.m. and continued for several hours, following a rapid, urgent rhythm that suggested someone working under deadline pressure. As a fellow office worker, I felt sympathetic toward whoever was putting in such long hours. The typing had an almost frantic quality that reminded me of my own late-night sessions when facing impossible project deadlines. Sometimes I would find myself unconsciously typing in rhythm with the sounds from next door, as if we were both struggling through the same endless workload. After 2 weeks of this nightly routine, I decided to introduce myself to my hard-working neighbor. However, when I knocked on the adjacent door, there was no response. The nameplate was blank, and there were no shoes visible in the Genkan area. When I asked the building superintendent, Watanabe-san, about the occupancy status, he confirmed that the unit had been empty for over 8 months. This information disturbed me deeply. If the apartment was vacant, where were the typing sounds coming from? I began paying closer attention to the exact timing and patterns. The typing always started at 11 p.m. sharp and lasted until approximately 3:30 a.m. The rhythm was consistent but intense, with occasional pauses that sounded like someone taking frustrated breaks before resuming work. What made the situation even stranger was that I began to recognize specific typing patterns. Certain sequences of keystrokes repeated regularly, as if the same documents were being worked on night after night. Sometimes I heard what sounded like mouse clicks and the soft beeping of computer notifications, creating a complete soundscape of someone engaged in intensive computer work. About 6 weeks into my residency, I decided to research the building's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained both the low rent and the mysterious typing sounds. According to online news archives, 8 months earlier, the previous tenant of the adjacent unit had died of karoshi, death from overwork. Suzuki Taro, a 32-year-old systems analyst, had been found dead at his desk after working continuously for over 40 hours without sleep. He had been trying to complete a critical project deadline when he suffered a fatal heart attack. The discovery was made several days later when concerned colleagues contacted building management after he failed to appear for important meetings. The news reports painted a tragic picture of modern Japanese work culture. Suzuki-san had been putting in 18-hour days for months, surviving on energy drinks and convenience store meals while trying to meet impossible software development deadlines. His final project was described as a system integration that required extensive coding and documentation work, exactly the type of intensive computer work that would produce the typing sounds I was hearing. Understanding the connection between my supernatural experiences and Suzuki-san's death made the nightly typing sounds much more disturbing. I was listening to his ghost continuing the work that had killed him, trapped in an eternal cycle of trying to meet deadlines that would never come. But the situation became personally terrifying when I realized that Suzuki-san's work habits were beginning to influence my own behavior. I found myself staying up later and later each night, driven by a compulsive need to complete just one more task, respond to one more email, finish one more project component. My 11 p.m. stopping time gradually shifted to midnight, then 1 a.m., then later. More disturbing was the realization that I was unconsciously organizing my work patterns to match the typing sounds from next door. When the ghostly typing paused, I would take breaks. When it resumed with renewed intensity, I felt compelled to work harder on my own projects. It was as if Suzuki-san's relentless work ethic was contaminating my own relationship with professional responsibilities. I began experiencing physical symptoms similar to those described in karoshi cases: chronic fatigue, irregular heartbeat, severe headaches, and a persistent feeling that no amount of work was ever sufficient. My supervisor at the advertising agency commented that my dedication was impressive, but seemed concerned about my increasingly haggard appearance. Most frighteningly, I started having episodes where I would find myself working at my computer with no memory of sitting down or deciding to work. I would regain consciousness at 3 or 4 a.m., having spent hours on projects that seemed urgent at the time, but were often minor tasks that could have waited until the next day. During these episodes, I felt driven by an overwhelming sense that incomplete work was not just professionally inadequate, but personally shameful. The voice in my head sounded increasingly like what I imagined Suzuki-san's internal monologue might have been: constant self-criticism about productivity, deadlines, and the need to work harder to prove professional worth. I realized that Suzuki-san's spirit was affecting me through our shared work environment and similar professional pressures. The identical apartment layout meant my desk was positioned exactly where his had been, creating a spiritual connection between our workspaces. My own stress and dedication to career advancement made me vulnerable to his obsessive work patterns. The situation reached a crisis point when I worked for 36 hours straight on a project that wasn't due for another week, driven by an irrational fear that any delay would result in professional failure. I only stopped when I collapsed at my desk and woke up 12 hours later with severe chest pains. Recognizing that I needed help, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in workplace spiritual disturbances. Monk Fujimoto had experience with karoshi-related hauntings and understood how modern work culture could create spiritual traps for both the living and the dead. Suzuki-san's spirit is trapped in the work patterns that killed him, Fujimoto-san explained. His sense of professional obligation was so strong that death couldn't break his commitment to completing his projects. He's trying to use your workspace and energy to finish what he started. The purification process involved blessing my apartment and performing specific rituals to help Suzuki-san's spirit understand that his work obligations had ended with his death. Fujimoto-san placed protective Ofuda talismans around my desk area and taught me meditation techniques to maintain spiritual boundaries between my own work motivations and external influences. However, he warned that completely eliminating Suzuki San's presence would be difficult because his work-related attachment was so deeply ingrained. Instead, we would need to establish protective measures that allowed me to maintain healthy work habits while preventing his obsessive patterns from overwhelming my own judgment. The intervention helped significantly, but it didn't end the supernatural activity entirely. I still hear typing sounds from adjacent apartment most nights, though less frequently and with reduced intensity. More importantly, I've regained control over my own work schedule and no longer feel compelled to work beyond reasonable hours. However, the experience fundamentally changed my perspective on Japanese work culture and professional expectations. Living next to Suzuki, San's restless spirit showed me how easily dedication to career success can transform into self-destructive obsession. The line between professional commitment and spiritual imprisonment is thinner than most people realize. I've continued living in this apartment because moving would create financial hardship, and because I've developed a strange sense of responsibility toward Suzuki, San's memory. Some nights, when I hear his typing, I find myself speaking softly toward the wall, reminding him that his work is finished and he can rest now. Whether this helps him find peace, I don't know, but it helps me maintain perspective on my own career priorities. The reduced rent that initially attracted me to this apartment came with hidden costs, not just dealing with supernatural activity, but confronting the toxic aspects of Japanese work culture that drive people to literal death from overwork. Every night at 11 p.m., when the typing begins, I'm reminded that professional success without personal boundaries is not achievement, but self-destruction. Suzuki, San's ghost, serves as a daily warning about the dangers of letting work identity completely consume personal identity. The most haunting realization is how easily I could have become trapped in the same patterns that killed him. The pressure to succeed, the fear of professional inadequacy, the belief that more work always equals better results. These are the spiritual poisons that create karoshi victims, and they're endemic to modern Japanese corporate culture. I still work hard and take pride in my professional accomplishments, but I've learned to recognize the difference between healthy dedication and obsessive compulsion. Some deadlines are worth missing if meeting them requires sacrificing your health or sanity. Some projects are worth leaving incomplete if finishing them means losing yourself in the process. The salaryman's echo continues next door, as it probably always will. But here in my apartment, I've learned to create work habits that serve life rather than consuming it. The typing sounds have become a nightly reminder that the most important deadline is the one that allows you to live to see tomorrow. Suzuki-san died trying to prove his professional worth through endless work. But his ghost has taught me that true professional success means knowing when to stop working and start living. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is close your computer and go to sleep. The Children's Playmate. My name is Naoko Yamada, and I am the mother of 5-year-old Riku. What I'm about to share happened when we moved into what seemed like the perfect family apartment in Setagaya Ward. I thought my biggest concern would be helping my son adjust to a new neighborhood, but instead I discovered that some children never truly leave their homes, even after death, and that a mother's protective instincts can become complicated when the threat to her child comes from another child's loneliness. In summer of 2023, my husband Takeshi and I were desperately searching for a larger apartment to accommodate our growing family. Our one-bedroom unit had become cramped with Riku's toys and belongings, and we wanted him to have his own room before starting elementary school. However, family-friendly apartments in decent Tokyo neighborhoods were well beyond our budget on Takeshi's salary as a junior high school teacher. That's when our real estate agent, Kobayashi-san, showed us a spacious 3 LDK apartment in a well-maintained building with excellent schools nearby. The rent was surprisingly reasonable for the area, and the unit had everything we needed: separate bedrooms, a proper living area, and even a small balcony where Riku could play safely. During our viewing, Kobayashi-san was unusually thorough in explaining the building's history. He informed us that 18 months earlier, a 7-year-old boy named Watanabe Sota had fallen from the balcony of apartment 407, 3 units down from the one we were considering. The incident had been classified as an accident, though the circumstances remained unclear. As required by law, I must disclose this information since the death occurred within the building complex. Kobayashi-san explained carefully. While the incident didn't happen in your specific unit, it affects the building's rental market and allows for reduced pricing. Takeshi and I exchanged glances. We had heard about Jikobuken properties and their associated stigmas, but our financial situation left us with limited options. The apartment was perfect for our family's needs, and the reduced rent would allow us to save money for Riku's education expenses. What exactly happened to the boy? I asked, partly from maternal concern and partly to understand what we might be accepting by living in this building. Kobayashi-san consulted his notes. Watanabe Sota was playing alone on his family's balcony while his parents were both working. The balcony railing met all safety standards, but somehow he fell. The family moved out shortly after the incident, and apartment 407 has remained vacant since then. Despite my uneasiness about the tragic history, Takeshi convinced me that the practical benefits outweighed my concerns. We needed the space, we could afford the rent, and the incident had occurred in a different unit entirely. We signed the lease and planned to move in before Riku's school year began. The apartment exceeded our expectations. It was bright, spacious, and perfect for family life. Riku was thrilled to have his own bedroom and spent hours arranging his toys and books in the new space. The balcony became his favorite area, where he would play with building blocks while I prepared meals in the adjacent kitchen. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed wonderful. Riku adjusted quickly to the new environment and showed no signs of the anxiety I had worried about. He was his usual, cheerful, imaginative self, creating elaborate games with his toy cars and action figures. Then he began talking about his new friend. "Mama, can Sota-kun come inside for lunch?" he asked one afternoon while playing on the balcony. I looked around but saw no other children. "Sota-kun? Who is that, Riku?" "My friend who lives here," he said matter-of-factly. "He knows everything about this building. He showed me which apartments have the best hiding spots and told me about all the grown-ups who live here." A chill ran down my spine at the mention of the name Sota, but I tried to remain calm. Young children often have imaginary friends, and Riku was adjusting to a new environment. I assumed he had invented a playmate to help himself feel more comfortable in unfamiliar surroundings. However, Riku's descriptions of his friend became increasingly detailed and specific. Sota-kun apparently knew which neighbors worked late, which families had arguments, and which apartments had the most interesting balcony views. This level of detail seemed unusual for an imaginary friend created by a 5-year-old. "Sota-kun says Tanaka-san in apartment 502 gets deliveries every Tuesday at 3 p.m., Riku announced one day. "And he says the lady in 403 always talks to her plants in the morning." I had no way to verify these observations, but Riku's confidence in sharing them made me uncomfortable. How would he know such specific details about our neighbors' routines? The situation became more concerning when Riku began asking permission to visit other parts of the building with his friend. "Sota-kun wants to show me the roof access," he said. "He says there's a good view of the whole neighborhood from up there." I firmly told him that he was not allowed to explore the building without me, especially not areas like the roof that could be dangerous. But Riku's requests became more frequent and specific, always involving locations that seemed inappropriately dangerous for a young child. About a month after moving in, I decided to ask our neighbor, Suzuki-san, about the building's layout and whether other children lived here. During our conversation, she mentioned that she remembered the Watanabe family and their son Sota. "Such a curious boy," Suzuki-san said sadly. "He was always exploring the building, asking questions about everyone who lived here. His parents both worked long hours, so he spent a lot of time alone. He knew more about the residents than most adults did. My blood turned cold as I realized the connection. Riku's imaginary friend shared the same name, age, and characteristics as the child who had died in this building. More disturbing was the possibility that Sota's spirit was still present and had formed a connection with my son. That evening, I sat down with Riku to ask more direct questions about his friend. "What does Sota-kun look like?" I asked gently. "He's a little bigger than me, with black hair that's always messy," Riku described. "He wears a blue shirt and knows all the best places to see things. But he says he gets lonely because the grown-ups can't see him anymore." This description, combined with Riku's knowledge of building details he couldn't have learned on his own, convinced me that my son was genuinely interacting with Sota's spirit. The deceased boy seemed to be using Riku as a way to continue his exploration and observation of the adult world he had been forced to leave behind. What made the situation particularly unsettling was that Sota's influence seemed to be encouraging increasingly risky behavior in Riku. My normally cautious son began asking to climb on balcony railings, explore stairwells alone, and visit high areas of the building that would be dangerous for any child. "Sota-kun says the best view is from the edge of the balcony," Riku told me one afternoon. "He wants to show me how to see everything from up there." I realized that Sota's spirit might be trying to recreate the circumstances that had led to his own death, possibly without understanding the danger this posed to Riku. The deceased child's curiosity and desire for exploration had become trapped in repetitive patterns that could put my living son at risk. I immediately contacted a child psychologist who had experience with supernatural phenomena affecting young children. Dr. Matsumoto explained that children Riku's age were naturally sensitive to spiritual presences, and that traumatic deaths often created spiritual attachments to locations where the deceased had been happy. "Sota's spirit is likely drawn to your son because Riku represents the childhood experiences and interactions he can no longer have," Dr. Matsumoto explained. "However, the deceased child's understanding of danger may be impaired, making this relationship potentially hazardous." She recommended that I consult with a Buddhist monk who specialized in helping child spirits find peace. Monk Ishida visited our apartment and confirmed that Sota's presence was indeed attached to the building, particularly the balcony areas where he had spent so much time exploring. Child spirits often become trapped by their strongest emotional attachments, Ishida-san explained. "Sota's love of discovery and his connection to this building have kept him bound here. He's using your son as a way to continue experiencing the world through childlike wonder." The purification process was delicate because it involved helping Sota understand that his time for earthly exploration had ended, while ensuring that Riku wouldn't be traumatized by losing his supernatural friend. Ishida-san performed gentle rituals, designed to guide child spirits toward peaceful rest rather than forceful banishment. He placed protective Ofuda talismans in Riku's bedroom and on our balcony, and taught me specific prayers to help Sota's spirit find acceptance of his situation. Most importantly, he helped me explain to Riku that his friend needed to go to a special place where children who have died can be happy and safe. The intervention helped, but it didn't immediately end Riku's connection to Sota. For several weeks, my son would still occasionally mention his friend, though the conversations became less frequent and less focused on dangerous activities. "Sota-kun says he's not lonely anymore," Riku told me one evening. "He says he understands now that he has to go to the place where children like him belong." Gradually, Riku's references to his supernatural playmate faded, and he began forming friendships with living children in our neighborhood. However, the experience left me with a profound appreciation for how vulnerable young children can be to spiritual influences and how a mother's protective instincts must extend beyond physical dangers to include supernatural ones. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization that Sota's spirit was genuinely lonely and seeking connection, but that his needs conflicted with my responsibility to keep Riku safe. The deceased child wasn't malicious, but his incomplete understanding of danger made him an inappropriate companion for my living son. I've learned to watch for signs that Riku might be susceptible to other supernatural influences, particularly during times of stress or major life changes when children's spiritual sensitivity can increase. Living in a building where a child died has taught me that parental protection requires awareness of both seen and unseen threats. Sometimes I still sense Sota's presence in our building, though he no longer seems to interact directly with Riku. I like to think that the spiritual intervention helped him understand that his exploration of the world needed to continue in a different realm, rather than through the experiences of living children. The reduced rent that initially attracted us to this apartment came with responsibilities I hadn't anticipated, not just dealing with supernatural activity, but helping a lonely child spirit find peace while protecting my own son from spiritual influences he was too young to understand. Riku has grown into a confident, well-adjusted child who occasionally mentions dreams about helping a friend find his way home. I believe these dreams represent his own processing of the supernatural relationship he experienced, and I'm grateful that he was able to help Sota's spirit without being permanently affected by the encounter. The children's playmate who brought us together taught me that some friendships transcend the boundaries between life and death, but that a mother's love requires knowing when to help those friendships reach their natural conclusion. Some connections are meant to be temporary bridges that help lost souls find their way to rest. Living in apartment 404 has been good for our family, but it's also been a reminder that every home carries the emotional history of those who lived there before. Sometimes that history includes children who died too young to complete their understanding of the world, and sometimes living families have the opportunity to help those children find the peace they need to move forward. Sota's playmate connection with Riku was a gift that allowed a lonely spirit to experience childhood wonder one more time before accepting that his exploration of this world had ended. And in helping Sota find peace, Riku learned that friendship sometimes means knowing when to say goodbye. The Night Shift Nurse. My name is Akiko Sato, and I am a registered nurse working night shifts at Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital. What I'm about to share happened during my first year living alone in a modest apartment building in Sumida Ward, when I thought my biggest challenge would be adjusting to irregular sleep schedules. Instead, I discovered that some patients never stop needing care, even after death, and that a nurse's instinct to heal can become a spiritual burden that extends far beyond hospital walls. In March of 2024, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in an older building that was perfect for my budget and schedule as a new graduate nurse. The unit was on the 4th floor of a 7-story complex, close enough to the hospital for easy commuting but affordable enough for someone just starting their healthcare career. The building housed mostly elderly residents and working professionals who appreciated the quiet atmosphere. My apartment was modestly furnished but comfortable, with thin walls typical of older Tokyo construction. I could hear my neighbors' daily routines, footsteps above, television sounds from adjacent units, and the general domestic activity of people living in close proximity. As a night shift nurse, my schedule was the reverse of most residents. I would leave for work around 10 p.m. and return home at 7:30 a.m., then sleep during the day when most people were at their jobs. This arrangement worked well initially, as the building was quiet during my sleeping hours. My work at the hospital involved caring for patients in the geriatric ward, where I dealt with elderly individuals suffering from various chronic conditions, terminal illnesses, and age-related health issues. It was demanding but rewarding work that required both medical skills and emotional compassion for patients who often had limited family support. About 6 weeks after moving in, I began noticing an unusual pattern in my building. There seemed to be an increased number of medical emergencies among the elderly residents, always occurring in apartments that shared walls or floors with my own unit. Ambulances would arrive frequently, usually during late evening hours when I was preparing for work, or early morning when I was returning home. Initially, I attributed this to coincidence and the building's demographics. Older residents naturally had higher rates of health problems, and it wasn't unusual for emergency medical services to be called regularly in elderly housing complexes. However, the timing and location of these incidents began to seem oddly concentrated around my living space. Mrs. Tanaka in apartment 403, directly adjacent to mine, was hospitalized twice for breathing difficulties. Mr. Yamamoto in 405, sharing my bedroom wall, had a cardiac event that required emergency intervention. The elderly woman in apartment 304, directly below my living room, was found unconscious by her daughter during a routine visit. What made these incidents particularly strange was that several of the affected residents mentioned experiencing unusual symptoms before their medical emergencies, feeling watched, hearing voices calling for help, and having dreams about being in a hospital or medical facility. About 3 months into my residency, the building superintendent Ito-san approached me with an unusual request. He had noticed that I was a healthcare professional and wondered if I had observed anything medically significant about the recent pattern of emergencies. "Sato-san," he said carefully, "I've been managing this building for 15 years, and I've never seen such a concentration of medical incidents. The residents seem to be experiencing problems that coincide with your work schedule." This conversation made me uncomfortable, as it suggested some connection between my presence and the health issues affecting my neighbors. However, I couldn't understand what relationship might exist between my work as a nurse and the medical emergencies occurring around my apartment. The situation became more disturbing when I began experiencing unusual sleep patterns during my day rest periods. I would have vivid dreams about caring for patients in hospital settings, but the patients in these dreams were often people I didn't recognize from my actual work. They appeared to be elderly individuals in various states of distress, calling for help with urgent medical needs. These dreams were so realistic that I would wake up exhausted, as if I had actually been working another shift. Sometimes I would find myself standing in my apartment with no memory of getting up, holding imaginary medical supplies and speaking to patients who weren't there. One morning, after an particularly intense night at the hospital, I woke up to find myself standing outside apartment 302, still wearing my scrubs and holding my nursing bag. I had no memory of leaving my apartment or walking to a different floor. The elderly man who lived in 302, Kobayashi-san, opened his door and seemed surprised but not alarmed to see me. "Oh, Sato-san," he said weakly. "I was just thinking I needed medical help. I've been feeling very unwell, but I didn't want to bother anyone so late." I checked his vital signs and found that he was indeed experiencing symptoms that warranted medical attention. After ensuring he received appropriate care, I realized that somehow my nursing instincts had guided me to a neighbor who genuinely needed help, even while I was apparently sleepwalking. This incident made me wonder if my medical training and professional sensitivity to health emergencies had created some kind of supernatural connection to the medical needs of people around me. As a nurse, I was trained to respond to distress signals and health crises, but it seemed that this responsiveness had extended beyond my conscious awareness. I decided to research the building's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained the concentration of medical incidents and my own sleepwalking episodes. Over the past 2 decades, dozens of elderly residents had died in various apartments throughout the building, many of them alone and without adequate medical attention. The building had a tragic history of residents who had suffered from illnesses, fallen, or experienced medical emergencies without anyone available to help them. Some had been discovered days or even weeks after death, having died alone despite being surrounded by neighbors who were unaware of their distress. Reading these records, I realized that my presence as a healthcare professional might be attracting the spiritual attention of deceased residents who had died without receiving the medical care they needed. My training and instinct to help sick people had created a kind of supernatural beacon that drew the attention of spirits who were still seeking the medical intervention they had been denied in life. This understanding was both fascinating and terrifying. While I felt honored that my professional calling could somehow provide comfort to those who had suffered alone, I was concerned about the impact this supernatural activity was having on my own health and the health of my living neighbors. The sleepwalking episodes became more frequent and more elaborate. I would find myself on different floors of the building, always near apartments where elderly residents lived, carrying nursing supplies and apparently providing medical care to invisible patients. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of these episodes, finding myself checking vital signs on people who weren't there, or explaining medical procedures to empty rooms. Most disturbing was the realization that some of the current medical emergencies among my neighbors might be connected to my supernatural activity. The deceased residents seemed to be using my nursing energy to manifest physical symptoms in living people, creating genuine medical crises that required real intervention. I recognized that I needed professional help to understand and manage this situation. I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in healthcare-related spiritual phenomena. Monk Hayashi had experience with medical professionals who had developed supernatural sensitivities related to their caregiving work. Your compassion and medical training have created a spiritual resonance with those who died without adequate care, Hayashi-san explained. The deceased residents are drawn to your healing energy because they never received the medical attention they needed in their final moments. He described this as a form of karmic attachment, where unfulfilled needs in death create spiritual connections to living individuals who possess the skills and compassion to address those needs. My nursing training had made me particularly vulnerable to this type of supernatural influence. The purification process involved helping the deceased residents understand that their medical needs could no longer be addressed in the physical world, while teaching me protective techniques to maintain spiritual boundaries around my professional compassion. Hayashi-san placed protective Ofuda talismans throughout my apartment and taught me specific prayers to recite before and after work shifts. Most importantly, he helped me develop meditation practices that would allow me to maintain my nursing instincts while preventing them from extending into supernatural caregiving. Your gift for healing should serve the living, he emphasized. The dead must find peace through spiritual means, not medical intervention. The intervention helped significantly reduce the sleepwalking episodes and the concentration of medical emergencies around my apartment. However, I still occasionally sense the presence of deceased residents who seem to be seeking medical attention, particularly during times when I'm emotionally or physically exhausted. Hospital work. I've learned to recognize the difference between genuine medical intuition about living patients and supernatural influence from deceased individuals. This awareness has actually made me a better nurse, as I've developed stronger boundaries around my professional empathy while maintaining my effectiveness in caring for actual patients. The experience has also given me a deeper understanding of the fear and loneliness that many elderly people face when dealing with health problems. The spirits in my building weren't malicious. They were simply souls who had died without the dignity and care that every person deserves in their final moments. I continue living in this apartment because moving would be financially difficult, and because I've developed a sense of responsibility toward the building's spiritual residents. Sometimes I still provide comfort to these spirits through prayer and acknowledgement of their suffering, but I no longer allow them to use my nursing energy for supernatural interventions. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how many people die alone without adequate medical care or human compassion. The spirits in my building represent a broader social problem in Japan, where elderly individuals often suffer in isolation due to family distance, social stigma around illness, and insufficient healthcare support systems. My supernatural experiences have made me more committed to ensuring that my living patients never feel abandoned or uncared for in their medical needs. Every elderly person I treat in the hospital could potentially become one of these lost spirits if they don't receive appropriate attention and compassion during their healthcare journey. The night shift nurse's burden isn't just caring for current patients, it's carrying the weight of knowing that inadequate care can create spiritual suffering that extends far beyond death. My apartment building has become a reminder that healing is not just a professional responsibility, but a spiritual calling that affects both the living and the dead. Living among these seeking spirits has taught me that true nursing involves not just medical skills, but understanding the deeper human need for dignity, attention, and care during vulnerable moments. Some patients' needs transcend the boundaries between life and death, and a compassionate healthcare worker must learn to honor those needs while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The deceased residents of my building have found some peace through spiritual intervention, but they've also taught me that the most important medical treatment is often simply being present with someone who is suffering. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from procedures or medications, but from ensuring that no one has to face their pain alone. Every night when I leave for my hospital shift, I carry the understanding that my work serves not just my assigned patients, but all those who have ever needed medical care and compassion. The spirits in my building have shown me that nursing is both a profession and a spiritual practice that continues to matter long after the physical need for medical intervention has ended. The Grandmother's Vigil. My name is Takeshi Watanabe, and I am a 43-year-old office manager who thought I was making a responsible decision when I moved my elderly mother into what seemed like the perfect senior-friendly apartment. What I discovered instead was that some forms of maternal devotion can survive death itself, and that my obligation to care for my own mother became complicated when another woman's unfulfilled parental longing began affecting our daily life. In autumn of 2023, my mother Fumiko reached the point where living alone in her traditional house had become unsafe. At 78, she was experiencing mild cognitive decline and had already had several minor accidents that made me realize she needed a more supportive living environment. However, she was adamantly opposed to moving into a formal care facility, insisting that she could maintain her independence with minimal assistance. After months of searching, I found what seemed like the ideal solution: a modern apartment in a building designed specifically for senior residents. The complex offered emergency call systems, accessible design features, and optional meal services, while allowing residents to maintain their own apartments. Most importantly, it was close enough to my office that I could visit regularly and assist with any needs that arose. The apartment we selected was a comfortable 2DK unit on the third floor, with an open living area perfect for entertaining visitors, and a small kitchen where my mother could continue cooking for herself. The rent was reasonable for the level of services provided, and the building had an excellent reputation for caring for elderly residents. During our apartment viewing, the building manager, Sasaki-san, mentioned that the previous tenant, an elderly woman named Hayashi-san, had lived there for over 15 years before passing away peacefully in her sleep the previous month. He assured us that the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned and renovated, and that Hayashi-san's death had been entirely natural with no traumatic circumstances. She was a wonderful tenant, Sasaki-san said warmly. Very quiet, very considerate of her neighbors. She spent most of her time in the apartment, preparing tea and reading. Her only sadness was that her son lived far away and couldn't visit very often. This information actually made the apartment more appealing to me, as I saw it as evidence that the building truly supported long-term elderly residents who could age in place comfortably. I was also determined to be the kind of attentive son that Hayashi-san's son apparently hadn't been, visiting my mother regularly and ensuring she never felt abandoned. My mother moved in during the first week of October, and initially everything went perfectly. She loved the apartment's layout, appreciated the safety features, and seemed to settle into her new environment with remarkable ease. I visited every few days after work and on weekends, helping with shopping, doctor's appointments, and household tasks. About 3 weeks after the move, I noticed that my mother had begun setting the table for 2 people every evening, even when I wasn't planning to visit. When I asked her about this, she explained that she was expecting company and wanted to be prepared in case someone stopped by. "It's only polite to have tea ready for guests," she said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. A good hostess should always be prepared to welcome visitors properly. I attributed this to the social isolation that many elderly people experience when moving to new environments. Setting the table for company seemed like a harmless way for her to maintain hope for social interaction, and I made a mental note to encourage her to participate in more building activities. However, the tea preparation ritual became increasingly elaborate and specific. My mother would set out her best china, arrange traditional sweets in precise patterns, and prepare exactly 2 cups of tea every evening at 5:30 p.m. She would then sit patiently at the table, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive at any moment. When I asked her who she was expecting, her answers became vague and inconsistent. Sometimes she said she was waiting for me, even when I had told her I wouldn't be visiting that day. Other times she mentioned the lady who needs company without providing any further explanation about who this might be. The most unsettling aspect of this routine was how my mother's personality seemed to change during these tea sessions. Normally, she was quite direct and practical in her communication style. But during these evening preparations, she became almost formal in her politeness, using elaborate honorific language as if she was hosting someone of great importance. I began staying for dinner more frequently to observe this behavior, and what I witnessed made me deeply uncomfortable. My mother would serve tea to the empty chair across from her, speaking softly to someone who wasn't there. She would nod occasionally as if listening to responses, and sometimes she would laugh gently at what seemed to be shared jokes. "Mother, who are you talking to?" I asked during one of these episodes. "Hayashi-san, of course," she replied matter-of-factly. "She's been so lonely for so long. Her son never visits, you know. It's terrible how some children neglect their elderly parents." The mention of Hayashi-san, the previous tenant, sent chills down my spine. I had never told my mother the woman's name or anything about her family situation. How could she know about Hayashi-san's son or his lack of visits? When I questioned her further, my mother insisted that Hayashi-san visited every evening for tea and conversation. According to my mother, the deceased woman was grateful to finally have someone who understood the loneliness of waiting for adult children who were too busy with their own lives to visit regularly. She tells me stories about how she would prepare tea every day, hoping her son would surprise her with a visit. My mother explained, but he only came once or twice a year and never stayed very long. Can you imagine how heartbroken she must have been? This conversation made me realize that my mother was somehow aware of intimate details about Hayashi-san's life and emotional state that she couldn't have learned through normal means. More disturbing was the possibility that my mother was being influenced by the deceased woman's unfulfilled desire for family attention. I decided to investigate Hayashi-san's background more thoroughly. When I spoke with other residents in the building, they confirmed that she had indeed spent years preparing daily tea for a son who rarely visited. Some neighbors described her as tragically devoted to maintaining hope for family connection that never materialized. She would dress up every afternoon as if expecting company. One neighbor told me she would prepare elaborate tea services and wait by the window, watching for visitors who never came. It was heartbreaking to see such dedication go unappreciated. Understanding this history, I realized that Hayashi, San's spirit, might be using my mother's natural hospitality to finally experience the family attention she had craved throughout her lonely final years. My regular visits to my mother were providing Hayashi-san with vicarious satisfaction of her unfulfilled maternal needs. What made this situation particularly complex was that the supernatural influence wasn't entirely negative. My mother seemed happier and more socially engaged since beginning her evening tea ritual. She had purpose and routine, and she genuinely seemed to enjoy her conversations with Hayashi, San's spirit. However, I became concerned when my mother began expressing guilt about my own visit frequency, comparing me unfavorably to what she perceived as my previous neglect. Hayashi-san reminds me how fortunate I am that you visit so often, she would say. But she also worries that you might become too busy and stop coming, just like her son did. This manipulation troubled me deeply. While I appreciated that Hayashi-san's influence was encouraging me to be an attentive son, it was also creating anxiety and obligation that felt supernatural rather than natural. I began to feel as though I was visiting not just my own mother, but also providing emotional care for a deceased woman whose family needs had never been fulfilled. The situation reached a turning point when my mother began insisting that I stay longer during visits, and began preparing increasingly elaborate meals as if hosting multiple guests. She would set places for 3 people, herself, me, and Hayashi-san, and would become distressed if I tried to leave after what seemed like a reasonable visit length. "You can't leave yet," she would protest. "Hayashi-san was just telling us about how lonely she feels when family members rush away too quickly." I realized that I needed professional help to understand and address this supernatural influence. I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in elderly spiritual phenomena, particularly cases involving deceased individuals who had died with strong, unfulfilled emotional attachments. Monk Koyama visited my mother's apartment and immediately confirmed that Hayashi, San's spirit, was indeed present and actively interacting with my mother. However, he explained that the situation was more complex than a simple haunting. "Hayashi, San's spirit has found in your mother someone who embodies the maternal role she treasured but felt was unappreciated," Koyama-san explained. "Your mother's willingness to prepare tea and provide hospitality has given Hayashi-san the family attention she desperately sought in life." He described this as a form of mutually beneficial spiritual arrangement, where both women were receiving emotional satisfaction, Hayashi-san, my mother through having a grateful recipient for her hospitality, and Hayashi-san through finally experiencing regular family-style attention. "The challenge," Koyama-san continued, "is ensuring that this arrangement doesn't become manipulative or demanding. Hayashi-san's need for family connection could become overwhelming if not properly managed." The spiritual intervention involved helping Hayashi-san understand that her need for family attention had been fulfilled sufficiently to allow her spirit to find peace, while also establishing boundaries that would protect my mother from excessive supernatural influence. Koyama-san performed purification ceremonies and placed protective ofuda in strategic locations throughout the apartment. However, he recommended that my mother be allowed to continue her evening tea ritual if it brought her comfort, as long as it didn't become compulsive or demanding. "Sometimes," he said, "helping a lonely spirit find peace can be a form of spiritual service that benefits both the living and the dead." The intervention helped establish healthier boundaries around the supernatural relationship. My mother still prepares tea for 2 most evenings, but the ritual has become less elaborate and less emotionally charged. She occasionally mentions conversations with Hayashi-san, but no longer pressures me to extend visits or makes guilt-inducing comparisons about family obligations. Most importantly, I've come to understand that my mother's supernatural companion has provided her with a sense of purpose and social connection that has actually improved her quality of life. Caring for Hayashi-san's emotional needs has given my mother a meaningful role that goes beyond simply being cared for herself. However, this experience has fundamentally changed my understanding of filial responsibility and the emotional needs of elderly parents. Living with the knowledge that Hayashi-san died, waiting for family attention that never adequately materialized, has made me more conscious of how my own visit patterns affect my mother's emotional well-being. I now visit more frequently and stay longer during each visit, not because of supernatural pressure, but because I've gained a deeper appreciation for how much family attention means to elderly parents. Hayashi-san's unfulfilled longing has taught me that the time I spend with my mother is not just practical caregiving, but emotional nourishment that will become irreplaceable after she's gone. The evening tea ritual continues, and I've learned to appreciate it as both my mother's spiritual service to a lonely soul and her way of maintaining social connection in an environment where elderly people can easily become isolated. Sometimes I join these tea sessions, and I like to think that Hayashi-san finally gets to experience the family conversations she waited decades to enjoy. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how many elderly people die, waiting for family attention that never comes. Hayashi-san's spirit represents countless parents who maintain hope for connection with adult children who are too busy, too distant, or too self-absorbed to provide regular emotional support. The grandmother's vigil in my mother's apartment continues, but it has become a reminder rather than a burden, a daily lesson about the importance of honoring our elderly parents while they can still appreciate our presence. Some forms of devotion are too powerful to be ended by death, and sometimes the living can provide healing for both themselves and restless spirits by simply showing up consistently with love and attention. My mother's supernatural tea companion has taught me that family obligations extend beyond practical care to include emotional presence, and that the time we spend with aging parents is both a gift to them and a protection against the kind of spiritual loneliness that can persist even after death. The Perfect Student. My name is Yumi Takahashi, and I am a third-year medical student at Tokyo Medical University. What I'm about to share happened during my most crucial academic year, when I thought my biggest challenge would be mastering complex medical concepts and surviving the brutal examination schedule. Instead, I discovered that some academic obsessions can transcend death itself, and that the pressure to achieve perfect grades can create spiritual prisons that trap both the living and the dead. In February of 2024, I was searching for a new apartment closer to the medical school campus. My previous shared housing situation had become impossible due to noisy roommates who didn't understand the demands of medical education. I needed a quiet, private space where I could study for 18 hours a day without interruption, especially with the critical third-year examinations approaching. When I found the listing for a studio apartment just 2 blocks from the university, it seemed too perfect to be true. The unit was specifically designed for serious students, with built-in bookshelves, excellent lighting, and a dedicated study desk positioned for optimal concentration. Most importantly, the rent was about 30% below market rate for the area. The real estate agent, Moriyama-san, was eager to finalize the lease quickly and didn't provide much background information about the apartment's history. When I asked about the low rent, he mentioned vaguely that the previous tenant had moved on to other opportunities, and that the landlord was motivated to find a new occupant promptly. During my viewing, I was impressed by how perfectly the space was organized for academic work. The previous tenant had clearly been a serious student. The walls were covered with medical charts and study schedules, and the desk area was equipped with multiple lamps and organizational systems that would be perfect for my own study needs. The previous tenant was very dedicated to her studies, Moriyama-san mentioned. She spent most of her time in this apartment preparing for medical school examinations. Everything is set up exactly as a serious student would need. I signed the lease immediately, grateful to have found such an ideal study environment at an affordable price. The timing was perfect, as I needed to begin intensive preparation for the comprehensive exams that would determine whether I could advance to fourth-year clinical rotations. I moved in during the first week of March and immediately established a rigorous study routine. The apartment's layout was indeed perfect for academic work, and I found myself more focused and productive than I had ever been before. I studied from early morning until late evening, taking only brief breaks for meals and basic necessities. For the first few weeks, everything seemed ideal. My grades improved dramatically, and I felt more confident about mastering the challenging medical curriculum than ever before. The apartment seemed to enhance my natural study habits and academic dedication. However, about a month into my residency, I began experiencing difficulty turning off my academic focus at the end of study sessions. Even when I tried to relax or sleep, my mind would continue racing through medical concepts, anatomy diagrams, and exam preparation strategies. I attributed this to normal pre-exam anxiety and the natural intensity of medical school pressure. But the compulsive studying gradually became more severe. I found myself getting up in the middle of the night to review notes, driven by an overwhelming fear that I hadn't studied enough. I would wake up at 3 a.m. with panic about forgetting crucial information, and I wouldn't be able to return to sleep until I had reviewed several more chapters of material. My study sessions became longer and more obsessive. What had started as 18-hour study days expanded to 20 hours, then 22. I stopped taking regular meal breaks, surviving on convenience store food and energy drinks, while maintaining constant focus on my textbooks and notes. Most disturbing was the realization that I couldn't seem to stop studying even when I tried. When I attempted to take breaks or engage in relaxation activities, I would feel overwhelming anxiety and guilt about wasting time that should be dedicated to academic preparation. The voice in my head constantly criticized any moment not spent studying as laziness and lack of dedication. About 6 weeks into my residency, I noticed that some of the study materials left by the previous tenant contained notes in margins that I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was similar to mine but not identical, and the content was more advanced than my current level of study. Some notes referenced examination topics that weren't part of my current curriculum. When I mentioned this to my study partner, Kato-san, she looked concerned and asked where I was living. When I gave her the address, her expression became alarmed. "Yumi-chan," she said carefully, "do you know what happened to the previous tenant in that apartment?" I told her that Moriyama-san had only mentioned that she had moved on to other opportunities. Kato-san shook her head sadly and explained that Sakurai Reina, a medical student 1 year ahead of us, had committed suicide in that apartment during exam period the previous year. She was found at her desk surrounded by study materials, Kato-san explained. She had been studying for over 48 hours straight without sleep when she took her own life. The pressure of medical school examinations had driven her to complete exhaustion and despair. Learning this information made me understand the source of my compulsive study habits and the mysterious notes in my materials. Sakurai-san's spirit was trapped in the apartment, still driven by the obsessive academic pressure that had consumed her final weeks of life. Her unfinished examination preparation had become a spiritual obsession that was affecting my own study patterns. The realization was both terrifying and tragically understandable. Medical school pressure in Japan is notorious for driving students to extreme behaviors, and the constant fear of failure can create academic obsessions that consume every aspect of life. Sakurai-san had died trying to achieve perfect academic performance, and her spirit was still pursuing those same impossible standards. Over the following weeks, I began to notice more direct evidence of supernatural influence. I would find my study materials reorganized in ways I didn't remember. always optimized for more efficient learning. My notes would contain additional information written in that unfamiliar handwriting, providing insights and explanations that exceeded my own knowledge level. Most frighteningly, I started experiencing episodes where I would find myself studying with no memory of sitting down at my desk. I would regain consciousness after hours of intensive academic work, having covered material at a pace and depth that seemed beyond my normal capabilities. During these episodes, it felt as though someone else was guiding my study process, driving me toward academic standards that were impossibly high. I realized that Sakurai, San's spirit, was using my academic dedication to continue her own unfinished examination preparation. Her obsessive study habits had become so deeply ingrained that death couldn't break her commitment to achieving perfect academic performance. She was trying to use my mind and energy to complete the studies that her suicide had interrupted. The situation reached a crisis point during midterm examination week, when I studied for 72 consecutive hours without sleep, driven by compulsions that felt external to my own academic goals. I only stopped when I collapsed at my desk and woke up 12 hours later with severe symptoms of exhaustion and dehydration. Recognizing that I needed help, I contacted the university's counseling services and explained my situation. The counselor, Yamada Sensei, had experience with students affected by academic-related supernatural phenomena and understood how the extreme pressure of medical education could create spiritual attachments related to study obsessions. She recommended that I speak with a Buddhist monk who specialized in helping spirits release their attachments to unfinished academic pursuits. Monk Nakamura visited my apartment and confirmed that Sakurai, San's spirit, was indeed trapped in repetitive study patterns that reflected her final weeks of obsessive examination preparation. Her dedication to academic success was so intense that death couldn't break her commitment to studying. Nakamura-san explained, "She's trying to use your scholarly energy to complete the examinations she never had the chance to take." The purification process involved helping Sakurai-san understand that her academic obligations had ended with her death, and that pursuing perfect grades was no longer necessary for her spiritual peace. Nakamura-san performed rituals designed to release spirits from worldly attachments and placed protective ofuda around my study area. However, he warned that completely eliminating her influence would be difficult because academic pressure in medical school created ongoing vulnerability to study-related spiritual contamination. "The environment that created her obsession still exists," he said. "You must learn to maintain healthy boundaries around your own academic dedication to prevent similar spiritual entrapment." The intervention helped significantly, but it didn't end my supernatural experiences entirely. I still occasionally sense Sakurai, San's presence during intensive study sessions, though she no longer seems to control my behavior directly. More importantly, I've regained the ability to stop studying and maintain healthy sleep and eating habits. However, the experience fundamentally changed my relationship with academic pressure and medical school expectations. Living with Sakurai, San's obsessive spirit showed me how easily dedication to academic success can transform into self-destructive compulsion. The line between healthy study habits and spiritual imprisonment is thinner than most students realize. I've continued living in this apartment because moving would create financial hardship, and because I've developed a sense of responsibility toward Sakurai, San's memory. Some nights, when I'm struggling with particularly difficult material, I speak to her spirit, reminding her that academic perfection isn't worth sacrificing mental health or life itself. Whether this helps her find peace, I don't know, but it helps me maintain perspective on my own academic goals. The reduced rent that initially attracted me to this apartment came with hidden costs, not just dealing with supernatural activity, but confronting the toxic aspects of medical education culture that drive students to dangerous extremes. Every time I sit at the study desk where Sakurai-san died, I'm reminded that academic success without personal well-being is not achievement but self-destruction. Her spirit serves as a daily warning about the dangers of allowing study pressure to completely consume personal identity and basic self-care. The most haunting realization is how easily I could have become trapped in the same patterns that killed her. The pressure to excel, the fear of academic failure, the belief that more studying always equals better results. These are the spiritual poisons that create tragic academic casualties, and they're endemic to Japanese medical education culture. I still study hard and take pride in my academic accomplishments, but I've learned to recognize the difference between healthy dedication and obsessive compulsion. Some examinations are worth failing if passing them requires sacrificing your sanity or your life. Some study sessions need to end even when the material isn't perfectly mastered. The perfect student's ghost continues to inhabit this apartment, as she probably always will. But here in my study space, I've learned to pursue academic excellence within boundaries that preserve both mental health and spiritual well-being. The obsessive study habits have become a reminder that the most important lesson in medical school is learning to care for yourself while learning to care for others. Sakurai-san died trying to prove her academic worth through endless studying. But her spirit has taught me that true academic success means knowing when to close the textbooks and prioritize your own well-being. Sometimes the most important medical knowledge is understanding that healing others begins with not destroying yourself in the pursuit of perfect grades. The study materials still bear traces of her handwriting, and I sometimes find my notes enhanced with insights that exceed my current knowledge level. But I've learned to appreciate these supernatural study aids while maintaining my own academic identity and healthy study boundaries. Some forms of dedication are too dangerous to emulate, even when they come from the most accomplished students. The delivery window. My name is Jiro Sasaki, and I work as a food delivery driver for one of Tokyo's major delivery platforms. What I'm about to share happened during my first year living in company-provided housing, when I thought my biggest challenges would be navigating traffic and meeting delivery deadlines. Instead, I discovered that some forms of social isolation can persist beyond death, and that my job connecting people with food became a supernatural bridge between the living and those who died craving human contact. In spring of 2024, I moved into a small apartment provided by my delivery company as part of their employee housing program. The unit was basic but adequate, a studio layout on the fourth floor of a 6-story building in Adachi Ward. Most importantly, the subsidized rent allowed me to save money while working in Tokyo's expensive delivery market. The apartment faced directly across a narrow courtyard to another residential building, giving me a clear view into several units in the opposite structure. During my off hours, I could observe the daily routines of neighbors going about their lives, cooking meals, watching television, and generally participating in the normal activities of urban apartment living. One unit directly across from my window appeared to be empty. The curtains were always drawn, no lights were ever visible, and I never saw any signs of occupancy during my first month of residency. I assumed it was vacant between tenants, which wasn't unusual in Tokyo's competitive rental market. My work as a delivery driver kept me busy during peak meal hours, lunch and dinner rushes when orders came rapidly and required quick turnaround times. I enjoyed the job because it allowed me to interact with many different people throughout the day, providing brief but meaningful human connections that made the work feel socially valuable. About 6 weeks into my residency, I began receiving unusual delivery orders through the app. These requests would come during off-peak hours, typically late evening or early morning, and always involved addresses in my immediate neighborhood. The orders were usually for simple convenience foods, instant ramen, rice balls, or basic bento meals, exactly the type of food that socially isolated people might order when they couldn't bring themselves to go shopping. What made these deliveries strange was that when I arrived at the specified addresses, I often found that no one was home or that the apartment numbers didn't exist. The delivery instructions would be very specific, directing me to buildings and units that seemed legitimate. But when I attempted to complete the delivery, I would discover that the apartments were vacant, or that residents claimed they hadn't placed any orders. Initially, I attributed this to technical glitches in the delivery app, or customers who had changed their minds and weren't answering their doors. However, the pattern became frequent enough that I started losing money on canceled deliveries and receiving complaints from my supervisor about incomplete orders. The situation became more disturbing when I realized that many of these mysterious orders were directing me to apartments that I could see from my own window. The delivery instructions would send me to units in the building across the courtyard, always during times when I could observe that the apartments appeared empty and dark. One evening in late May, I received an order for instant ramen and convenience store onigiri to be delivered to apartment 403 in the building directly across from mine. The delivery instructions were unusually detailed, specifying that I should knock softly because the resident doesn't like loud noises, and that I should leave the food by the door if there's no answer because he might be sleeping. When I arrived at the building, I found apartment 403 easily enough, but the unit appeared to have been vacant for months. There was no nameplate, no shoes in the Genkan area visible through the door's small window, and when I knocked, there was no response. The apartment felt completely empty, with the kind of silence that suggests long-term vacancy. However, when I returned to my own apartment and looked across the courtyard, I could see a faint light in the window of 403, exactly the apartment I had just visited. The light was dim and flickering, like a single candle or a dying flashlight, and it seemed to move occasionally as if someone was walking around inside. This experience made me realize that something supernatural was affecting my delivery work. The mysterious orders were coming from someone or something that existed in a state between life and death, and my job was being used to fulfill the needs of spirits who had died, craving human contact and basic care. Over the following weeks, I began researching the building across the courtyard and discovered its tragic history. About 8 months earlier, a 35-year-old man named Watanabe Koji had been found dead in apartment 403 after being undiscovered for nearly 3 weeks. He had been a hikikomori, a social recluse, who had withdrawn from society and lived in complete isolation. According to news reports, Watanabe-san had survived entirely on food delivery and convenience store purchases, ordering meals through apps and having groceries delivered to avoid any face-to-face human interaction. His death had been discovered only when neighbors complained about odors, and the investigation revealed that he had died alone, surrounded by empty delivery containers and convenience food packaging. Understanding this background, I realized that Watanabe-san's spirit was using my delivery work to continue receiving the food service that had been his only connection to the outside world during his final years. His desperate need for human contact, even the brief interactions with delivery workers, had created a spiritual attachment to the delivery system itself. The supernatural orders became more frequent and more specific. I would receive requests for exactly the types of food that a hikikomori might order, simple, non-perishable items that required no cooking or preparation. The delivery instructions would always emphasize discretion and minimal interaction, exactly the preferences that someone with severe social anxiety would request. Most disturbing was the realization that I was beginning to feel compelled to complete these impossible deliveries. Even when I arrived at empty apartments or non-existent addresses, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave the food somewhere, as if failing to complete the delivery would be abandoning someone who desperately needed help. I started experiencing episodes where I would find myself making deliveries with no memory of receiving orders through the app. I would regain consciousness standing outside empty apartments with bags of food, having apparently purchased and delivered meals to addresses that existed only in some supernatural ordering system. During these episodes, I felt the profound loneliness and social anxiety that had consumed Watanabe-san's final years. The isolation was so intense that even brief contact with delivery workers had become precious human interactions that he couldn't bear to lose, even after death. The situation reached a crisis point when I began making delivery attempts to apartments where previous residents had died alone. The supernatural ordering system seemed to be connecting me with other spirits who had experienced similar social isolation and death without human contact. I was being used as a messenger to provide food and brief human presence to deceased individuals throughout my neighborhood. Recognizing that I needed help, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in urban spiritual phenomena, particularly cases involving social isolation and death without family connection. Monk Ogawa had experience with hikikomori-related supernatural activity and understood how modern social isolation could create spiritual attachments. Watanabe-san's spirit is trapped in the patterns that defined his final years. Ogawa-san explained. His dependence on delivery services for both food and human contact was so complete that death couldn't break his attachment to this system. He described this as a form of social haunting, where spirits who had died in extreme isolation continued to seek the minimal human connections that had sustained them in life. My work as a delivery driver made me particularly vulnerable to this type of supernatural influence because I represented the bridge between isolated individuals and the outside world. The purification process involved helping Watanabe-san understand that his need for food and human contact could no longer be fulfilled through delivery services, while teaching me protective techniques to maintain boundaries around my professional compassion for isolated customers. Ogawa-san placed protective ofuda around my apartment, particularly near the window that faced Watanabe-san's former residence. He also taught me specific prayers to recite before and after work shifts to prevent supernatural customers from affecting my delivery routes. Your work serves an important social function, he emphasized, but you must learn to distinguish between genuine customers who need food delivery and spirits who are seeking impossible connections to life. The intervention helped significantly reduce the supernatural delivery orders, though I still occasionally receive mysterious requests that lead to empty apartments. More importantly, I've regained control over my own work schedule and no longer feel compelled to complete impossible deliveries. However, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of social isolation and the role of delivery workers in modern Japanese society. Living across from Watanabe-san's apartment showed me how delivery services can become lifelines for people who have lost the ability to maintain normal social connections. I've become much more aware of customers who might be experiencing severe isolation, and I've learned to provide the brief but meaningful human interactions that delivery work can offer. Sometimes, a friendly greeting or a moment of patient conversation can be the only human contact that isolated individuals receive for days or weeks. The supernatural orders still occasionally appear on my delivery app, usually during late evening hours when social isolation feels most intense. When this happens, I acknowledge Watanabe-san's continued presence, but explain that his earthly needs for food and contact have ended, and that he should seek peace rather than perpetual delivery service. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how many people die alone in Tokyo, surviving only through the minimal human contact provided by delivery workers, convenience store clerks, and other service workers who represent their last connections to society. Every delivery I make now carries the awareness that I might be providing not just food, but essential human contact for someone who has no other social connections. The brief interactions that delivery work requires, greeting customers, confirming orders, sharing a moment of politeness, can be profoundly meaningful for people who are struggling with isolation. The delivery window in my apartment continues to look across at Watanabe-san's former residence, and sometimes I still see that flickering light in his window. But I've learned to understand it as a reminder rather than a supernatural customer, a sign that social isolation is a serious problem that affects both the living and the dead. My work has become more than just delivering food. It's become a form of social service that connects isolated individuals with the outside world. Some customers need more than just meal delivery. They need the human dignity that comes from being acknowledged and treated with kindness, even during brief commercial interactions. The supernatural delivery orders taught me that true customer service involves recognizing when someone is desperately isolated and providing the human warmth that can make the difference between connection and complete social withdrawal. Sometimes the most important thing I deliver isn't food, but the simple acknowledgement that someone exists and matters enough to be treated with respect and care. Watanabe-san's spirit continues to remind me that delivery work serves people who might otherwise have no human contact at all, and that the brief interactions I provide through my job can be lifelines for those who are struggling to maintain any connection to society. Some orders are about much more than food. They're about preserving human dignity in a world where it's possible to become completely invisible. The Substitute Mother. My name is Emiko Sato, and I am a recently divorced mother of 2 young children. What I'm about to share happened during the most vulnerable period of my life, when I thought my greatest challenge would be rebuilding our family after divorce. Instead, I discovered that some maternal bonds can transcend death itself, and that my struggle to provide a stable home for my children became complicated when another mother's lost parental rights created a supernatural claim on my family. In autumn of 2023, my divorce from my ex-husband Takeshi was finalized after 2 years of painful legal proceedings. I was awarded primary custody of our 7-year-old daughter Yuki and 5-year-old son Daiki, but the financial settlement left me with very limited resources for housing. As a single mother with only part-time work experience, finding affordable family housing in Tokyo seemed nearly impossible. After months of searching, I found a 2 LDK apartment in an older complex in Katsushika Ward that was within my budget range. The rent was significantly below market rate for a family-sized unit, and the landlord seemed eager to accommodate single mothers, which made the application process surprisingly smooth. The real estate agent, Fujiwara-san, mentioned that the previous tenant had moved away suddenly about 6 months earlier, but he didn't provide specific details about why the rent was so affordable. I was so relieved to find suitable housing that I didn't press for more information about the apartment's history. The unit was on the 3rd floor with 2 bedrooms, perfect for giving each child their own space, and a living area where we could spend time together as a family. Most importantly, it represented a fresh start where I could focus on creating a stable, loving environment for Yuki and Daiki after the disruption of our divorce. We moved in during the first week of October, and initially everything seemed perfect. The children adapted well to their new rooms, and I began establishing routines that would help us function as an independent family unit. I was determined to prove that I could provide everything my children needed without relying on their father or extended family support. About 3 weeks after moving in, I began noticing subtle changes in my children's behavior. Yuki and Daiki would occasionally mention things that Mama had told them, referring to conversations I was certain I hadn't had with them. When I asked for clarification, they would become confused and insist that I had said these things even though I had no memory of the conversations they described. Initially, I attributed this to the stress and confusion that children often experience after major life changes like divorce and moving. However, the pattern became frequent enough that I started paying closer attention to what they claimed I had told them. Mama said we should always clean our plates because wasting food makes mothers sad, Yuki told me one evening at dinner. This was concerning because I had never said anything about food waste making mothers sad. It seemed like an unusually emotional way to discuss table manners with young children. Similarly, Daiki began insisting that Mama had taught him specific songs and games that I had never shown him. These activities seemed age-appropriate and harmless, but they were completely unfamiliar to me. When I asked where he had learned them, he would look confused and insist that I had taught them to him. Most disturbing was their increasing tendency to seek permission for activities by addressing empty space in the apartment, as if asking an invisible authority figure for approval. They would look toward corners of rooms and say things like, "Is it okay if I play with this toy, Mama?" Before playing with items I had already given them permission to use. About a month into our residency, the children began talking explicitly about the other mama who lived in our apartment. According to Yuki and Daiki, this other mother was very kind and caring, but also very sad about something they couldn't understand. "She takes care of us when you're busy," Yuki explained matter-of-factly. "She makes sure we're safe and tells us stories about her own children who had to go away." This conversation made me deeply uncomfortable, particularly the reference to children who had to go away. I began to suspect that something supernatural was affecting my family, and that another mother's presence was influencing my children's behavior and loyalties. I decided to research the apartment's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained both the affordable rent and the mysterious maternal presence affecting my children. The previous tenant, Nakamura Ayako, had lost custody of her two young children during a bitter divorce proceeding and had committed suicide in the master bedroom about 6 months before we moved in. According to court records I found online, Ayako-san had struggled with depression and had been deemed an unfit mother by family court, with custody awarded to her ex-husband. She had fought desperately to maintain contact with her children, but supervised visitation had eventually been terminated entirely due to concerns about her mental state. News reports indicated that she had died alone in the apartment, surrounded by photographs and belongings from her children who were no longer allowed to visit. Her suicide note expressed overwhelming grief about losing her maternal role and her desperate wish to continue caring for children who needed a mother's love. Understanding this background, I realized that Ayako-san's spirit was attempting to fulfill her frustrated maternal instincts through my children. Her powerful need to be a mother had survived death and was now focused on Yuki and Daiki, who represented the family connections she had lost in life. The supernatural influence became more direct and concerning over the following weeks. My children began preferring activities and routines that I hadn't established, claiming that the other mama had taught them better ways to do things. They would resist my parenting decisions by comparing them unfavorably to guidance they claimed to receive from the invisible maternal presence. "The other mama says we shouldn't eat that," Daiki would protest when I offered certain foods. "She knows what's best for children because she misses her own children so much." Most frighteningly, my children began expressing sympathy for Ayako-san's situation and subtle criticism of my own parenting choices. They would mention how sad it was that some mothers lose their children, and how important it was for children to appreciate mothers who were still with them. I realized that Ayako-san was using my children's natural empathy to create emotional bonds that competed with their loyalty to me. She was positioning herself as a more understanding, more devoted mother who had been unfairly separated from her children, while subtly undermining my authority and confidence as their actual parent. The situation reached a crisis point when Yuki told me that the other mama thought I was working too much and not spending enough quality time with them. She suggested that maybe I should take a long rest, like the other mama had done, so that someone who really understood children could take better care of them. This conversation terrified me because it suggested that Ayako-san's influence was encouraging my children to see my absence as potentially beneficial to exactly the type of thinking that had preceded her own suicide when she felt replaced as a mother. I immediately contacted a family counselor who had experience with supernatural phenomena affecting children after trauma. Dr. Ishikawa explained that children were naturally vulnerable to spiritual influences during times of family disruption, and that maternal spirits often sought to attach themselves to families that reminded them of their own lost relationships. She recommended that I consult with a Buddhist monk who specialized in helping spirits resolve unfulfilled parental attachments. Monk Hashimoto visited our apartment and confirmed that Ayako-san's presence was indeed attempting to establish a maternal relationship with my children. Her need to be a mother was so strong that losing custody created spiritual trauma that death couldn't heal, Hashimoto-san explained. She's trying to use your children to continue the maternal role that was taken from her in life. The purification process was delicate because it involved helping Ayako-san understand that her maternal needs could not be fulfilled through my children, while ensuring that Yuki and Daiki wouldn't be traumatized by losing their supernatural companion. Hashimoto-san performed rituals designed to help Ayako-san find peace with her loss and accept that her time as an earthly mother had ended. He placed protective ofuda in the children's bedrooms and taught me specific prayers to strengthen my own maternal authority within our home. However, he warned that completely eliminating her influence would be challenging because maternal attachment is one of the strongest spiritual bonds, and children's emotional openness made them particularly susceptible to surrogate parental figures. The intervention helped establish clearer boundaries between Ayako-san's presence and my family relationships. My children still occasionally mention the other mama, but they no longer seek her permission for activities or compare her favorably to my own parenting. Most importantly, I've regained my confidence as their primary parent and learned to recognize when external influences are affecting our family dynamics. The supernatural custody battle taught me that being a strong mother requires not just providing care, but also protecting my children from influences that could undermine our family bonds. However, experience left me with a profound appreciation for how devastating the loss of maternal rights can be. Ayako-san's spirit wasn't malicious. She was a grieving mother whose love for her children had become desperate and possessive after being legally separated from them. I continue living in this apartment because moving would create financial hardship and because I've developed empathy for Ayako-san's loss. Sometimes I speak to her spirit, acknowledging her pain while firmly maintaining that Yuki and Daiki are my children and that I will protect them from any influence that threatens our family stability. The reduced rent that initially attracted me to this apartment came with hidden emotional costs, not just dealing with supernatural activity, but confronting the reality that maternal love can become distorted when mothers lose access to their children through legal or social circumstances. Every day, I'm reminded that being a good mother requires not just love and care, but also the legal and social recognition that allows maternal relationships to flourish. Ayako-san's tragedy shows how quickly a mother can lose everything when family courts determine she's unfit to parent, and how that loss can create spiritual wounds that persist beyond death. The substitute mother who tried to claim my children taught me that maternal authority must be actively maintained and protected. Some influences are too powerful to ignore, and some bonds are too important to allow supernatural interference, no matter how sympathetic the source. My children have learned that they have one mother who is alive, present, and capable of caring for them, and that other maternal figures, whether living or dead, cannot replace the unique bond between a parent and child. The supernatural custody battle reinforced rather than threatened our family connection, because it forced me to fight for my role as their mother. Ayako-san's presence continues in our apartment, but it has become a reminder rather than a threat, a daily lesson about the importance of appreciating the maternal relationships we have while we can maintain them. Some mothers lose their children through circumstances beyond their control, but I have the opportunity and responsibility to be the mother my children need while I can still hold that role in their lives. The other mama will always be part of our apartment's history, but Yuki and Daiki know that I am their real mother, and that no supernatural influence can change the legal, emotional, and practical bonds that make us a family. Some claims on children are stronger than death, and a living mother's love will always triumph over a dead mother's longing. The building manager's rounds. My name is Suzuki Masato, and I have been the building manager for Sunset Heights Apartments in Narama Ward for 28 years. What I'm about to share represents the accumulated weight of nearly 3 decades managing residential housing, when I thought my greatest responsibility was maintaining safe, comfortable living conditions for current tenants. Instead, I discovered that some housing complaints never get resolved, even after death, and that my authority over building maintenance extends into the supernatural realm in ways I never anticipated. I began working as building superintendent in spring of 1996, when Sunset Heights was a relatively new 7-story complex housing, mostly young professionals and small families. The building was well designed and properly maintained, and I took pride in providing responsive service to residents who needed assistance with everything from plumbing issues to noise complaints. Over the years, I developed detailed knowledge of every unit's history, maintenance records, and the personal circumstances of tenants who had lived there. This information was essential for my work, as understanding past problems helped me prevent future issues and provide informed service to new residents. However, as building manager, I also became aware of tragic events that occurred in various apartments: deaths from illness, accidents, and occasionally suicide. Some of these incidents required legal disclosure to prospective tenants under Jikobuken regulations, while others fell outside the 3-year disclosure requirement or involved circumstances that didn't mandate reporting. By 2024, I had accumulated knowledge of dozens of deaths throughout the building's history. Each incident was documented in my private records, though only a fraction required official disclosure. This information weighed heavily on my conscience, as I understood the human stories behind each tragedy while maintaining professional obligations to current and prospective residents. My daily responsibilities included morning and evening security rounds, during which I would walk through all 7 floors, checking hallways, stairwells, and common areas for maintenance issues or security concerns. These rounds had been routine for decades, providing opportunities to observe the building's condition and occasionally interact with residents who were coming or going. About 2 years ago, I began experiencing unusual encounters during my evening security rounds. Initially, these took the form of maintenance requests from residents I didn't recognize. Elderly individuals who would approach me in hallways to complain about issues in apartments that I knew were currently vacant or occupied by different tenants entirely. "Suzuki-san," an elderly woman said to me one evening near apartment 307, "The heating in my unit hasn't worked properly for months. When can you arrange for repair service?" I checked my records and found that apartment 307 was currently occupied by a young couple who had never reported heating problems. When I knocked on their door to inquire, they confirmed that their heating system was functioning normally and that they had never spoken to anyone about maintenance issues. However, my building records indicated that 15 years earlier, an elderly woman named Hayashi-san had died in apartment 307 during winter, and that her final complaints to the previous building manager had involved inadequate heating that made her apartment uncomfortably cold. This incident made me realize that I was encountering the spirit of a former tenant who was still trying to resolve maintenance problems that had affected her during life. Her housing complaints had become so important to her that death hadn't ended her desire to receive proper building management service. Over the following months, these supernatural encounters became a regular part of my evening rounds. Deceased former tenants would approach me in hallways, stairwells, and common areas, always near apartments where they had once lived, seeking resolution for maintenance issues that had troubled them during their residency. "The water pressure in my shower is terrible," complained an elderly man near apartment 502. "I've been asking for repairs for years, but nothing gets fixed properly. My neighbors upstairs make noise all night," insisted a middle-aged woman outside apartment 208. "You need to speak with them about being more considerate." "The balcony door in my unit doesn't lock securely," worried a young mother near apartment 406. "It's not safe for my children. Please arrange for a locksmith." Each complaint corresponded to documented issues from my historical records, maintenance problems that these individuals had reported during their lifetimes, often repeatedly, before dying with their housing concerns unresolved. What made these encounters particularly challenging was that the deceased tenants expected me to address their complaints with the same professional attention I provided to living residents. They would become agitated if I explained that I couldn't help them, and they would return night after night seeking progress updates on repairs that could never be completed. My supernatural workload began affecting my ability to serve current tenants effectively. I found myself spending increasing amounts of time during security rounds listening to complaints from deceased residents, which delayed my response to actual maintenance issues reported by living tenants. More disturbing was my growing compulsion to document and attempt to address the supernatural maintenance requests. I began writing work orders for problems that existed only in the spirit world, repair services for apartments that no longer had the issues described, heating adjustments for units where the systems were functioning properly, and noise investigations for disturbances that only dead tenants could hear. The situation became more complex when I realized that some supernatural maintenance requests were legitimate concerns that could affect current residents. Deceased tenants often complained about structural problems, safety hazards, or building defects that had been overlooked during their lifetimes but could still pose risks to current occupants. "The electrical wiring in apartment 603 is dangerous," warned an elderly man who had died there 8 years earlier. "I smelled burning plastic for weeks before I died, but no one would listen to me." When I inspected apartment 603, I discovered that the current tenant had indeed been experiencing electrical problems that could pose fire hazards. The deceased tenant's complaint had led me to identify a genuine safety issue that required immediate professional attention. This incident taught me that the supernatural maintenance requests weren't just spiritual nuisances. They sometimes contained valuable information about building problems that needed addressing. The deceased tenants' continued concern for their former homes reflected genuine care for the building's condition and the safety of current residents. However, distinguishing between supernatural complaints that contained useful information and those that reflected only the deceased tenants' unresolved frustrations became increasingly difficult. I found myself investigating every spiritual maintenance request thoroughly, which consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, while often yielding no actionable results. My situation reached a crisis point when I began issuing actual work orders and scheduling professional services for supernatural maintenance requests. I arranged for plumbers to address pipe problems that didn't exist, electricians to repair wiring that was functioning properly, and contractors to fix structural issues that were only visible to dead tenants. These unnecessary service calls cost the building management company significant money and created confusion among current residents who couldn't understand why repair workers were accessing their apartments to fix problems they hadn't reported. Recognizing that I needed help managing my supernatural responsibilities, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in residential spiritual phenomena. Monk Takeda had experience with building managers who had developed spiritual sensitivities related to their long-term knowledge of tenant histories. "Your decades of service to this building have created a spiritual connection to all the residents who have ever lived here," Takeda-san explained. "The deceased tenants see you as the one person who can still help them resolve their earthly concerns." He described this as a form of professional spiritual attachment, where my role as building manager had made me a bridge between the living and the dead. My authority to address maintenance issues had attracted the attention of deceased tenants who still needed resolution for problems that had affected their quality of life. The purification process involved helping the deceased tenants understand that their housing complaints belonged to the past and that their former apartments were now the responsibility of current residents. Takeda-san performed rituals designed to release spirits from their attachment to unresolved maintenance issues. However, he warned that completely eliminating the supernatural encounters would be difficult because my professional knowledge of the building's history and my genuine concern for tenant welfare made me naturally attractive to spirits seeking help with housing problems. Your dedication to serving residents has created a reputation that extends beyond life, he said. Some tenants will always see you as the person who can fix their problems, even after death. The intervention helped establish boundaries around my supernatural responsibilities, while allowing me to continue providing professional service to living tenants. I still encounter deceased residents during security rounds, but I've learned to acknowledge their concerns without feeling obligated to address issues that belong to the spirit world. Most importantly, I've developed the ability to distinguish between supernatural complaints that contain useful building information and those that reflect only spiritual frustration. When deceased tenants provide warnings about genuine safety hazards or structural problems, I investigate thoroughly. When they seek resolution for personal grievances that can't affect current residents, I express empathy, but explain that their concerns are beyond my current authority. The experience has fundamentally changed my understanding of what it means to be a building manager in a property with decades of residential history. Every apartment contains layers of tenant experiences, and some of those experiences include unresolved problems that continue to matter to former residents even after death. I've learned to see my role as serving not just current tenants, but also honoring the memory of previous residents who cared about the building's condition and wanted future occupants to have better experiences than they did. The supernatural maintenance requests often reflect genuine love for the building and concern for the welfare of all residents, past and present. My evening security rounds continue to include encounters with deceased tenants, but these interactions have become collaborative rather than demanding. Former residents share their knowledge of the building's history and potential problems, while I provide professional expertise about current maintenance standards and safety requirements. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how many housing problems go unresolved during people's lifetimes, and how much these issues can matter to residents who depend on building management for safe, comfortable living conditions. Some maintenance complaints represent serious quality of life concerns that deserve professional attention, even when they come from tenants who are no longer alive. The building manager's rounds have taught me that property management is not just about maintaining physical structures, but about honoring the trust that residents place in building authorities to address their concerns and protect their welfare. Some responsibilities extend beyond current leases and rental agreements to include the accumulated hopes and frustrations of everyone who has ever called a building home. Every maintenance request, whether from living or deceased tenants, represents someone's desire for a safe, comfortable living environment. The supernatural complaints have made me more responsive to current residents' concerns and more thorough in addressing potential problems before they become serious issues. The deceased tenants of Sunset Heights continue to seek resolution for their unfinished housing complaints, but they've also become informal consultants who help me maintain the building more effectively for current residents. Some forms of professional dedication create connections that transcend death, and sometimes the most valuable maintenance advice comes from people who have experienced the building's problems firsthand over many years. My supernatural workload has become a permanent part of managing this property, but it has also made me a better building superintendent by expanding my understanding of how housing problems affect residents' lives, and by providing access to decades of accumulated knowledge about the building's condition and history. The cooking lessons. My name is Rei Nakamura, and I have been married for 8 months to my husband Takeshi. What I'm about to share happened during our first year of marriage, when I thought my greatest challenge would be learning to cook traditional Japanese meals that would honor our new household and please my husband's family. Instead, I discovered that some culinary knowledge can be passed down through supernatural means, and that my desperate desire to become a skilled wife created a spiritual vulnerability that nearly cost me my life. Takeshi and I married in spring of 2024, after a brief courtship that began through mutual friends. He is a kind, traditional man who works as an accountant and values the domestic skills that his mother had emphasized as important for a good wife. During our engagement, I had confessed to him that my own mother had died when I was young, leaving me without proper training in cooking and household management. "Don't worry, Rei-chan," he had assured me. "Marriage is about learning together. I'm sure you'll become an excellent cook once you have your own kitchen to practice in." However, this reassurance only increased my anxiety about fulfilling my role as a proper wife. I had grown up with my father, who relied heavily on convenience foods and takeout meals. My cooking experience was limited to basic dishes that barely qualified as proper home-cooked food. After our wedding, we moved into a small 2DK apartment in Katsushiki Ward that was perfect for a young couple starting their married life. The kitchen was compact but well-equipped, and I was excited to begin learning the traditional recipes that would make our house feel like a real family home. The real estate agent, Tanaka-san, had mentioned that the previous tenant was an elderly woman who had lived alone and passed away peacefully in her sleep. The apartment was clean and well-maintained, with a kitchen that showed signs of frequent use by someone who had clearly been an accomplished cook. During our first week in the apartment, I attempted to prepare traditional meals for Takeshi, but struggled with even basic dishes, like miso soup and rice preparation. My attempts at Japanese home cooking were embarrassing failures that left me feeling inadequate as a new wife. "The rice is too hard again," Takeshi would say gently, trying not to hurt my feelings. "Maybe you need more practice with water measurements." "The vegetables in the miso soup are cut unevenly," his mother commented during her first visit to our new home. "Proper knife skills are essential for a young wife to learn." These criticisms, though delivered kindly, made me feel desperately inadequate. I began spending hours each day attempting to master basic cooking techniques, but my progress was frustratingly slow. I was terrified that my husband and his family would conclude that I was unsuitable as a wife if I couldn't provide proper home-cooked meals. About 3 weeks after moving in, something began to change in my cooking abilities. I found myself instinctively knowing techniques that I had never learned, such as proper knife angles for cutting vegetables and timing methods for preparing multiple dishes simultaneously. At first, I attributed this to intensive practice and natural improvement. However, the knowledge I was gaining seemed to come from somewhere beyond my own experience. I would find myself using cooking methods that I had never read about or seen demonstrated, yet they produced consistently excellent results. "Rei-chan, this takoyaki is amazing," Takeshi said one evening after I had prepared a complex dish that I had never attempted before. "Where did you learn to make it so perfectly?" I couldn't answer his question honestly because I didn't understand how I had acquired the knowledge myself. During cooking sessions, I would feel guided by instincts that seemed to come from outside my own experience, as if invisible hands were showing me proper techniques. The supernatural cooking guidance became more pronounced over the following weeks. I would begin preparing meals with specific ingredients in mind, only to find myself creating elaborate traditional dishes that required ingredients I hadn't planned to use. My hands would move with confidence through complex preparation steps that I had never learned. Most remarkably, I was consistently producing restaurant-quality traditional meals that impressed not only Takeshi but also his mother, who had previously been skeptical of my domestic abilities. "You've become such an accomplished cook so quickly," she marveled during a family dinner. "These dishes taste exactly like the traditional recipes my own mother used to make." However, the supernatural cooking assistance came with increasingly disturbing elements. I would find myself preparing elaborate meals during times when I had planned to cook simple dishes, driven by compulsions to create complex traditional feasts that seemed more appropriate for special occasions than everyday dinners. More concerning was my growing obsession with perfecting every detail of meal preparation. I would spend entire days planning and preparing single meals, unable to stop cooking until every element met impossibly high standards. The voice in my head constantly criticized any imperfection and demanded that I continue working until each dish achieved perfect traditional authenticity. About 2 months into our residency, I began experiencing episodes where I would find myself cooking with no memory of starting meal preparation. I would regain consciousness standing in the kitchen surrounded by partially prepared traditional dishes, having apparently been working for hours without conscious awareness. During these episodes, I felt possessed by the cooking knowledge and domestic dedication of someone much more experienced than myself. The techniques I used and the dishes I prepared reflected decades of traditional Japanese cooking expertise that I couldn't possibly have acquired in my short marriage. I realized that the previous tenant's spirit was influencing my cooking, sharing her culinary knowledge through supernatural means. However, I was also beginning to understand that her guidance came with expectations and obligations that extended beyond simple recipe instruction. The deceased woman seemed to demand that I dedicate myself completely to domestic perfection, spending all of my time and energy on elaborate meal preparation. Her standards were impossibly high, and her approval depended on my willingness to sacrifice everything else in my life for the pursuit of culinary excellence. I decided to research the apartment's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained both the supernatural cooking guidance and the dangerous expectations that accompanied it. The previous tenant, Yamamoto Fumiko, had been a 73-year-old woman who had died alone while preparing an elaborate traditional dinner that was never completed. According to the police report, Fumiko-san had suffered a heart attack while cooking, and her body was discovered surrounded by partially prepared dishes that represented hours of intensive meal preparation. She had been known in the neighborhood as an exceptional cook who maintained traditional recipes and techniques with obsessive dedication. The report also revealed that Fumiko-san had become increasingly isolated in her final years, with cooking being her primary source of purpose and identity. She had continued preparing elaborate meals even though she lived alone and had no family to share them with, as if the act of cooking itself had become more important than the social function it was meant to serve. Understanding this background, I realized that Fumiko-san's spirit was using my cooking as a way to complete the final meal that her death had interrupted. Her obsessive dedication to culinary perfection had survived death and was now being channeled through my own desperate desire to become a skilled wife. However, I was beginning to recognize that Fumiko-san's standards were not just demanding, but potentially deadly. Her spirit seemed to expect the same level of total dedication that had consumed her own final years, requiring me to sacrifice my health, social relationships, and personal identity for the pursuit of cooking perfection. The situation reached a crisis point when I began preparing Fumiko-san's final meal, the elaborate traditional dinner that she had been cooking when she died. I found myself working obsessively on this complex multi-course feast, unable to stop or rest until every element was completed exactly as she had intended. During this episode, I realized that completing Fumiko-san's final meal might require the same tragic ending that had claimed her life. Her spirit seemed to believe that true culinary dedication required total sacrifice, including the cook's own well-being and survival. I collapsed in the kitchen after working for 18 consecutive hours on the supernatural meal, and only Takeshi's quick response in calling emergency services prevented me from suffering the same fate as Fumiko-san. Recognizing that I needed help managing this supernatural influence, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in domestic spiritual phenomena. Monk Sasaki had experience with spirits who had become obsessively attached to household duties and understood how the pressure to fulfill traditional gender roles could create spiritual vulnerabilities. Fumiko-san's identity was so completely tied to cooking that death couldn't separate her from her culinary responsibilities. Sasaki-san explained, "She's trying to use your marriage to continue the domestic perfection that defined her entire life." The purification process involved helping Fumiko-san understand that her cooking knowledge could be shared without requiring total sacrifice from me, while teaching me to maintain healthy boundaries around domestic responsibilities and traditional expectations. Sasaki-san placed protective ofuda around the kitchen area and taught me prayers to recite before cooking that would allow me to access Fumiko-san's culinary knowledge without being overwhelmed by her obsessive standards. Cooking should serve life and relationships, he emphasized. When domestic duties become more important than the people they're meant to nurture, they become spiritually dangerous. The intervention helped me establish a healthier relationship with both cooking and Fumiko-san's spirit. I still benefit from her culinary knowledge and can prepare traditional meals that please Takeshi and his family, but I no longer feel compelled to achieve impossible perfection or sacrifice my well-being for domestic excellence. However, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of traditional gender roles and the pressure that Japanese wives face to fulfill domestic expectations. Fumiko-san's obsessive dedication to cooking reflected broader social pressures that can transform natural caregiving impulses into self-destructive compulsions. I continue living in this apartment and continue benefiting from Fumiko-san's cooking guidance, but I've learned to appreciate her knowledge while rejecting her impossible standards. Some nights, when I'm preparing dinner, I thank her spirit for sharing her culinary wisdom while explaining that my value as a wife extends beyond cooking perfection. The supernatural cooking lessons taught me that traditional domestic skills should enhance rather than define my identity as a wife. Fumiko-san's spirit serves as both a resource and a warning about the dangers of allowing cultural expectations to consume personal identity and individual well-being. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how easily domestic pressure can become spiritual imprisonment. The desire to be a good wife through cooking excellence is admirable, but when that desire becomes obsessive, it can destroy the very relationships it was meant to nurture. Every meal I prepare now carries the understanding that cooking should serve love rather than demanding sacrifice. Fumiko-san's spirit continues to share her culinary knowledge, but I've learned to use her expertise in service of creating a happy marriage rather than pursuing the domestic perfection that cost her everything. The cooking lessons continue in my kitchen, but they now emphasize balance rather than obsession. Some traditions are worth preserving, but not at the cost of the people they're meant to serve. The most important ingredient in any meal is the love and care it represents, not the technical perfection of its preparation. My husband enjoys my cooking, and his family appreciates my domestic skills, but they love me for who I am rather than what I can prepare in the kitchen. Fumiko-san's spirit taught me to cook, but more importantly, she taught me that being a good wife means knowing when domestic duties should serve family happiness rather than demanding total sacrifice from the person performing them. The Commuter's Schedule. My name is Daisuke Hayashi, and I work as a platform attendant for JR East at Kogane Station on the Chuo Line. What I'm about to share happened during my first year working the early morning shift, when I thought my biggest challenge would be adjusting to the 4 a.m. wake-up time required for my job. Instead, I discovered that some commuting patterns can become so deeply ingrained that they persist beyond death, and that my proximity to the railway created a supernatural vulnerability that nearly cost me my life. In March of 2024, I was hired as a station attendant after completing my training program with JR East. The position required starting work at 4:30 a.m. to prepare for the morning rush hour that begins around 5:30. This schedule was demanding but offered stable employment with good benefits, which was important for supporting my elderly parents. To make my early morning commute manageable, I found a small studio apartment just 3 blocks from Kogane Station. The rent was surprisingly affordable for the location, and the short walk to work would allow me to get extra sleep compared to commuting from farther away. The real estate agent, Watanabe-san, mentioned that the previous tenant had relocated suddenly about 4 months earlier, and that the landlord was eager to find a reliable new occupant. The apartment was clean and well maintained, with a view of the train tracks that I found comforting rather than noisy, since my work involved being around trains all day. During my first month in the apartment, I established a routine that worked perfectly with my job schedule. I would wake up at 3:45 a.m., quickly prepare for work, and walk to the station by 4:15 to begin my shift. The early morning streets were quiet and peaceful, providing a contemplative start to each workday. My responsibilities as a platform attendant included safety monitoring, crowd management during rush hour, and assisting passengers with various needs. I took pride in helping ensure the smooth operation of one of Tokyo's busiest commuter lines, and felt that my work contributed to the daily lives of thousands of people. About 6 weeks into my residency and employment, I began experiencing unusual episodes during my early morning routine. I would wake up at the correct time, but find myself walking toward the station much earlier than necessary, sometimes arriving at the platform over an hour before my shift began. Initially, I attributed this to enthusiasm for my new job and natural anxiety about being late. However, the early departures became compulsive, and I found myself unable to stay in my apartment even when I tried to delay leaving for work. More disturbing was the realization that during these early morning walks, I wasn't following my usual route to the employee entrance. Instead, I would find myself walking directly to the passenger platform, standing at the edge and staring down the tracks in the direction from which the morning express train approached. These episodes were concerning because platform safety was a crucial part of my job training. Standing too close to the track edge was dangerous, and as a railway employee, I understood the serious risks involved in trains traveling at high speeds. Hayashi-san, you seemed distracted during morning briefings. My supervisor, Tanaka-san, mentioned after I had been working for about 2 months. Is everything all right with your living situation? I explained that I had been having difficulty with my morning routine, but didn't mention the compulsive early departures or the episodes of standing at the platform edge. I was embarrassed about these behaviors and concerned that reporting them might affect my employment. However, the compulsive behavior became more frequent and more intense. Every morning, I would find myself leaving my apartment well before necessary and walking directly to the platform like a passenger rather than an employee. During these episodes, I felt driven by routines and motivations that didn't belong to me. Most frighteningly, I began experiencing overwhelming urges to step off the platform onto the tracks, particularly when I could hear the morning express approaching in the distance. These impulses felt external to my own thinking, as if someone else's intentions were influencing my actions. About 3 months into my residency, I decided to research the apartment's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained both my compulsive morning behavior and the dangerous urges I was experiencing. The previous tenant, Kojima Hiroshi, had committed suicide by jumping in front of the morning express train at Kogane Station. According to news reports, Kojima-san had been a 42-year-old office worker who had been struggling with severe depression and work-related stress. He had lived in my apartment for over 2 years before taking his life on a cold December morning, throwing himself in front of the 5:57 a.m. express train. The incident had occurred during the peak of morning rush hour, causing significant delays and traumatizing both passengers and railway staff. The investigation revealed that Kojima-san had been experiencing financial difficulties and had been facing potential job loss due to company restructuring. Understanding this background, I realized that Kojima-san's spirit was trapped in the final commuting routine that had led to his death. His morning journey to the station had become so habitual that death couldn't break the pattern, and now his spiritual energy was affecting my own daily routine. My apartment's proximity to the train line and my job at the same station where he died created perfect conditions for spiritual contamination. Kojima-san's final commute was being replayed through my morning schedule, and his suicidal intentions were influencing my behavior during the most vulnerable time of day. The situation became critical when I realized that the timing of my compulsive episodes corresponded exactly with Kojima-san's final journey. I was unconsciously recreating his last morning routine, walking to the station at the same time and standing at the same platform location where he had ended his life. The supernatural influence reached a dangerous peak one foggy morning in late June, when I found myself standing at the platform edge as the 5:57 a.m. express approached. I could feel an overwhelming compulsion to step forward, driven by Kojima-san's desperate final decision and his need to complete the journey that had been interrupted by death. Only the quick intervention of a fellow station worker who noticed my dangerous position prevented me from following through with the suicidal impulse that belonged to Kojima-san's spirit rather than my own conscious intentions. Recognizing that I needed help managing this supernatural influence, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in railway-related spiritual phenomena. Monk Ogawa had experience with cases involving suicide victims whose final actions had created spiritual attachments to transportation systems. Kojima-san's morning commute had become so deeply ingrained that death couldn't break the routine. Ogawa-san explained, "Your similar schedule and proximity to the scene of his death have made you vulnerable to reliving his final journey." He described this as a form of temporal spiritual contamination, where traumatic final actions create repetitive spiritual patterns that can affect people who follow similar routines in the same locations. My work schedule and living situation had made me particularly susceptible to this type of supernatural influence. The purification process involved helping Kojima-san's spirit understand that his final commute had ended and that he no longer needed to continue the journey that had led to his death. Ogawa-san performed rituals designed to break the spiritual attachment to repetitive actions and locations. He placed protective ofuda in my apartment and taught me specific prayers to recite during my morning routine that would maintain spiritual boundaries between my own intentions and external influences. Most importantly, he helped me modify my daily schedule to avoid the exact timing and route that had triggered the supernatural episodes. "Your work serves the living passengers who depend on safe railway operations," he emphasized. Kojima-san's spiritual needs cannot be allowed to interfere with your ability to protect current commuters. The intervention helped significantly reduce the compulsive morning episodes and eliminated the dangerous urges to step onto the tracks. However, I still occasionally sense Kojima-san's presence during early morning hours, particularly when I'm walking to work in weather conditions similar to those on the morning he died. I've learned to recognize the difference between my own routine motivations and supernatural influences that attempt to recreate Kojima-san's final actions. This awareness has actually made me more effective at my job. as I've developed heightened sensitivity to passenger behavior that might indicate distress or safety concerns. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of railway suicide and the impact these incidents have on both transportation systems and the people who work to maintain them. Every day, I see commuters rushing to catch trains, and I'm reminded that some of them might be struggling with the same desperation that consumed Kojima-san's final weeks. I continue living in the apartment near the station because moving would create financial hardship, and because I've developed a sense of responsibility toward both Kojima-san's memory and the safety of current passengers. My proximity to the scene of his death has taught me to recognize the warning signs of someone contemplating suicide by train. Sometimes, when I notice passengers exhibiting concerning behavior on the platform, I approach them with offers of assistance or simply provide the human contact that might help them reconsider dangerous impulses. My supernatural experience with Kojima-san has made me more attuned to the emotional states of people who use the railway system. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how routine and desperation can combine to create tragic outcomes. Kojima-san's final commute was probably similar to thousands of ordinary morning journeys he had made, except that one day, his emotional pain made the regular trip to the station into a final destination. Every morning when I walk to work, I'm reminded that the commuters I serve might be facing challenges that could transform their routine journeys into something dangerous. The railway system that connects people to their daily lives can also become a means of escape from unbearable circumstances. The commuter's schedule continues to influence my morning routine, but it has become a reminder rather than a compulsion. Kojima-san's spirit taught me that some patterns are too powerful to be broken by death alone, and that the people who work in transportation systems have responsibilities that extend beyond operational efficiency to include awareness of human suffering. My supernatural commute has made me more compassionate toward passengers and more vigilant about platform safety. Some journeys are meant to end at destinations that support life and connection, while others are driven by desperation that must be redirected toward help and hope rather than tragic finality. The early morning train schedule that once threatened to claim my life through supernatural influence has become my opportunity to serve living commuters who deserve to complete their journeys safely. Kojima-san's final commute serves as a daily reminder that railway work involves protecting not just physical safety, but also recognizing when someone's journey might need intervention to prevent tragedy. Every train that arrives safely at its destination represents countless individual stories of people traveling toward their daily lives. And I've learned that sometimes the most important part of my job is ensuring that those stories continue rather than end at the platform where I work. The Perfect Housewife. My name is Kumiko Sato, and I am a 31-year-old mother of 2 young children who has spent the last 5 years as a full-time housewife. What I'm about to share happened during a period when I felt overwhelmed by the pressure to maintain perfect domestic standards while raising my family. Instead of finding the pristine home environment I dreamed of creating, I discovered that some forms of domestic perfectionism can become spiritual prisons that trap both the living and the dead in cycles of impossible expectations. In summer of 2024, my husband Kenji received a promotion that required relocating to Tokyo from our previous home in Nagoya. While this advancement was excellent for his career, it meant leaving behind my support network of family and friends who had helped me manage household responsibilities and childcare for our 6-year-old daughter Yui and 4-year-old son Taro. Finding family housing in Tokyo within our budget was challenging, especially since we needed space for the children and proximity to good schools. After weeks of searching, we found a 3 LDK apartment in Sumida Ward that seemed perfect for our family's needs, spacious, well-lit, and affordable enough to allow me to continue staying home with the children. The real estate agent, Ishida-san, mentioned that the previous tenant had been a very dedicated housewife who had maintained the apartment in excellent condition before moving to be closer to family. The unit was indeed immaculate, with every surface gleaming and every detail perfectly organized in a way that impressed even my particular standards for cleanliness. During our viewing, I felt inspired by how beautifully maintained the apartment was. The kitchen was spotless, with every appliance positioned precisely and storage areas organized with methodical efficiency. The living spaces showed no signs of wear, despite being occupied by a family, and even the children's areas were arranged with museum-like perfection. The previous tenant took great pride in her home. Ishida-san mentioned. She spent considerable time each day ensuring everything met her high standards. You can see the results of her dedication throughout the apartment. I was thrilled to move into such a well-maintained space, and felt motivated to continue the standards of domestic excellence that the previous tenant had established. As a housewife, I took pride in creating a beautiful, organized home environment for my family, and this apartment seemed like the perfect canvas for my own domestic artistry. We moved in during the first week of August, and I immediately began establishing cleaning and organization routines that would maintain the apartment's pristine condition. However, I found myself feeling compelled to clean and organize far more extensively than had been my habit in our previous home. The cleaning standards I set for myself became increasingly demanding. I would spend entire days scrubbing surfaces that already appeared clean, reorganizing closets that were already perfectly arranged, and polishing appliances that showed no signs of wear or dirt. The voice in my head constantly pointed out flaws and imperfections that required immediate attention. "Mama, why are you cleaning the bathroom again?" Yui asked one afternoon when I was scrubbing the tiles for the third time that day. "It already looks perfect." I couldn't explain to her that the bathroom didn't feel clean enough, despite appearing spotless. Something inside me demanded higher standards of cleanliness than I had ever maintained before, and I felt anxious and inadequate whenever any surface was less than perfectly pristine. My daily routine became dominated by cleaning and organizing activities that consumed increasing amounts of time and energy. I would wake up early to begin cleaning before the children got up, clean throughout the day between childcare activities, and often continue cleaning late into the evening after they went to bed. Kenji began expressing concern about my obsessive cleaning behavior, especially when it started interfering with family time and childcare responsibilities. "Kumiko-chan, the house is already perfectly clean," he would say gently. "You don't need to spend so much time scrubbing things that are already spotless." But I couldn't stop the compulsive cleaning patterns, even when I recognized that they were excessive. The standards I was trying to meet felt impossibly high, and every small imperfection triggered overwhelming anxiety that could only be relieved through intensive cleaning and organizing. Most disturbing was the realization that I was beginning to neglect the children's emotional needs in favor of maintaining domestic perfection. I would become frustrated when their normal childhood activities created messes or disrupted the pristine organization I had spent hours achieving. "Don't touch the clean windows," I would snap at Taro when he wanted to look outside. "Keep your toys in exactly the right places," I would insist to Yui when she was playing. I was becoming the type of rigid, obsessive mother I had never wanted to be. About 2 months into our residency, I began experiencing episodes where I would find myself cleaning with no memory of starting the activity. I would regain consciousness scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, organizing areas that were already perfectly arranged, and following cleaning routines that exceeded any reasonable standards of household maintenance. During these episodes, I felt guided by domestic knowledge and perfectionist standards that seemed to come from outside my own experience. The cleaning techniques I used and the organizational systems I implemented reflected decades of obsessive housekeeping expertise that I couldn't possibly have developed in my own 5 years as a housewife. I realized that the previous tenant's spirit was influencing my domestic behavior, sharing her cleaning obsessions and impossible standards through supernatural means. However, I was also beginning to understand that her guidance was not helpful but destructive, demanding levels of perfection that were consuming my sanity and destroying my family relationships. I decided to research the apartment's history more thoroughly. What I discovered explained both the supernatural cleaning compulsions and the dangerous perfectionism that accompanied them. The previous tenant, Tanaka Michiko, had been a 34-year-old housewife who had committed suicide in the apartment after suffering a complete mental breakdown from domestic perfectionism. According to police reports and neighbor interviews, Michiko-san had become increasingly obsessed with maintaining perfect household standards, spending up to 18 hours per day cleaning and organizing while neglecting her own health and family relationships. Her husband had been working long hours and was largely absent from home, leaving her alone with the children and the impossible domestic standards she had created for herself. The investigation revealed that in her final weeks, Michiko-san had stopped eating and sleeping regularly, dedicating every waking moment to cleaning and re-cleaning surfaces that were already spotless. She had developed a mental condition where no amount of cleaning ever felt sufficient, and any small imperfection in the household triggered severe anxiety and compulsive behavior. Her suicide note expressed despair about her inability to achieve the domestic perfection she believed was necessary to be a good wife and mother. She had died believing that her worth as a woman depended entirely on maintaining impossible household standards that ultimately destroyed her mental health and family relationships. Understanding this background, I realized that Michiko-san's spirit was trapped in the obsessive cleaning patterns that had consumed her final years. Her need to achieve domestic perfection had survived death and was now affecting my own household routines, driving me toward the same self-destructive perfectionism that had claimed her life. The supernatural influence became more direct and dangerous over the following weeks. I found myself cleaning for 20 hours straight without food or rest, driven by Michiko-san's impossible standards and her belief that domestic perfection was more important than personal health or family happiness. My children began expressing fear about my behavior, and Kenji threatened to take them to stay with his parents if I didn't seek help for what he perceived as a serious mental health crisis. The situation reached a breaking point when I collapsed in the kitchen after scrubbing the floor continuously for 8 hours, having not eaten or rested for 2 days, in my pursuit of cleaning standards that could never be satisfied. Recognizing that I needed help managing this supernatural influence, I contacted a Buddhist monk who specialized in domestic spiritual phenomena. Monk Yamada had experience with spirits who had become obsessively attached to household duties and understood how social pressure on wives and mothers could create spiritual vulnerabilities. Michiko-san's identity was so completely tied to domestic perfection that death couldn't separate her from her cleaning obsessions. Yamada-san explained, "She's trying to use your housekeeping to continue the domestic excellence that defined her entire existence." The purification process involved helping Michiko-san understand that her cleaning knowledge could be shared without requiring total sacrifice from me, while teaching me to maintain healthy boundaries around domestic responsibilities and social expectations. Yamada-san placed protective ofuda around areas where I had experienced the most intensive cleaning episodes, and taught me prayers to recite that would allow me to maintain a clean home without being overwhelmed by supernatural perfectionism. Housekeeping should serve family happiness and health, he emphasized. When domestic duties become more important than the people they're meant to benefit, they become spiritually dangerous. The intervention helped me establish a healthier relationship with both housekeeping and Michiko-san's spirit. I still maintain a clean, organized home that my family enjoys, but I no longer feel compelled to achieve impossible standards of domestic perfection or sacrifice my well-being for household appearance. However, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of the pressure that Japanese wives and mothers face to fulfill domestic expectations. Michiko San's obsessive cleaning reflected broader social pressures that can transform natural caregiving impulses into self-destructive compulsions. I continue living in this apartment and continue benefiting from some of Michiko-san's organizational knowledge. But I've learned to appreciate practical household skills while rejecting impossible perfectionist standards. Some nights, when I'm doing routine cleaning, I speak to her spirit, thanking her for caring about the home, while explaining that my value as a wife and mother extends far beyond housekeeping excellence. The supernatural cleaning lessons taught me that domestic skills should enhance rather than define family life. Michiko-san's spirit serves as both a resource and a warning about the dangers of allowing social expectations to consume personal identity and family relationships. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization of how easily domestic pressure can become spiritual imprisonment. The desire to be a good wife and mother through perfect housekeeping is admirable, but when that desire becomes obsessive, it can destroy the very family happiness it was meant to create. Every cleaning task I perform now carries the understanding that housework should serve love rather than demanding sacrifice. Michiko-san's spirit continues to influence my home organization, but I've learned to use her expertise in service of creating a comfortable family environment rather than pursuing the domestic perfection that cost her everything. The Perfect Housewife's ghost reminds me daily that the most important household standard is family happiness and well-being. Some forms of domestic dedication are too dangerous to emulate, no matter how impressive the results might appear to outside observers. My husband and children appreciate our clean, organized home, but they love me for who I am, rather than what I can accomplish with cleaning supplies and organizational systems. Michiko-san's spirit taught me valuable household skills, but more importantly, she taught me that being a good mother means knowing when domestic duties should serve family happiness, rather than demanding total sacrifice from the person performing them. The cleaning continues in our home, but it now emphasizes balance rather than obsession. Some standards are worth maintaining, but not at the cost of the family relationships they're meant to support. The most important thing I clean and organize each day is the emotional atmosphere that allows my children to feel loved and my husband to feel welcomed, rather than intimidated by impossible domestic perfection.